So hey guys, the series name is What If Naruto and Sothis Were Cute Couple? So let's start the series. Every Konoha citizen knows the story of October 10th, the day the demon, the Kyuubi no Kitsune, wreaked havoc onto the village and caused the death of over 400 citizens and shinobi combined. Whether it be brothers, sisters, friends or family, all suffered from the unprovoked attack that left many homeless, jobless and, in extreme cases, forever disabled. No one in the village went unaffected by the Kyuubi's attack, and many to this day are still mourning for their loss. However, more than the attack itself, many remembered the name and actions of the man that saved them from destruction. His name was Minato Namikaze, and he was the fourth Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, Hidden Leaf Village. On the day of the attack, he fought and triumphed against the demon that laid waste to his home. But at the cost of his own life, many were told that he killed the Kyuubi no Kitsune, and many believed this tale. But many more knew the truth. A few days after the Kyuubi attack, there was a huge assembly at the Hokage Tower with all shinobi present, and many civilians awaiting their Hokage's speech. It turned out the third Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, Hiruzen Sarutobi, was reinstated, and he wanted to lift the spirits of his people by telling them the final wishes of the fourth Hokage. He wished to reassure the masses that the Kyuubi was indeed defeated and reveal the true hero of Konoha, newborn Naruto Uzumaki, son of the Yondaime and the one who now held the strongest Bijuu in the elemental nations within himself and becoming Konoha's next Jinchuriki. Unfortunately, Hiruzen vastly underestimated the hatred that ran through his own people. Instead of people praising the boy like the Yondaime wanted, they spat curses and demanded his death. On that same day, a law was passed. No one was to speak of the Kyuubi's host on punishment of death. Naturally, this brought more outcries, mainly from the civilian populace. But after many trying, and failing, to end the demon child's life, most by execution by Konoha's elite Anbu forces protecting the child, people kept their scorn to themselves and swore to get their revenge for their lost loved ones in other meaningful ways without losing their lives. This was how Konoha was for the next 12 years, licking their wounds while making one Naruto Uzumaki's life a living hell on the side, whether it was overcharging him for food and other items, or outright throwing him out of their shops. They were all getting their pounds of flesh slowly. However, to everyone's shock, horror and frustration, he never cried, he never screamed, retaliated, or even showed a frown. In fact, as the years went by, it became harder and harder to take their frustrations out on the emotionless blonde, mind you, not for a lack of trying. He just seemed to be able to avoid trouble altogether and never got caught committing crimes despite things magically disappearing whenever he was around. If that wasn't frustrating and scary enough, the fact he has been caught multiple times talking to himself throughout the years had both citizens and shinobi on their toes. In one particular incident, the blonde laughed out of nowhere, the first emotion ever seen on the blonde, that the people around him felt a sudden shudder go up their spines and backed away from him slowly. And many shinobi and citizens alike reported it to the Hokage that same day. The blonde was forced to visit the Hokage that day, and nothing like that has happened ever since. Some thought he was talking with the Kyuubi, while others thought the blonde had finally snapped. But only Naruto knew, and would ever know, what was so funny that day. Now, there is a clear reason why the Kyuubi attack on Konoha was so important to history itself. It was the day the Yondaime died while sealing the Bijuu, yes. But the important part of that was how the Yondaime sealed the beast. In another time, or alternate reality, the Yondaime would have used the Fuinjutsu, Shiki Fujin, sealing technique, dead demon consuming seal, to seal the beast within his son. But in this time and space, he did not know such a jutsu. Instead, he used the only other sealing jutsu he knew, a time-space jutsu that would seal the demon's chakra fully into his son while taking his life in the process. It was a jutsu he and his wife Kushina had worked years on and was forced to use in its incomplete state. He had gotten the idea from his signature technique, the Hiraishin, and put its space-time elements into a seal that would put the being it was sealing into a completely different dimension, while still being connected to the individual it was being sealed into. It was supposed to be a last resort just in case anything was to happen to Kushina's seal, the Jinchuriki of the beast at the time, and they needed to quickly transfer the beast away before it got loose and killed her and the people around it. It was a complicated process, but they were so close to completing it. Unfortunately, the time for it to be used came closer than they would have liked, and both perished after using said jutsu to transfer the Kyuubi into their only child while being impaled by said beast. Their deaths were not in vain since they succeeded in sealing the demon. However, There was a golden rule with seals: if a seal was incomplete on one force chakra into it, it would have one of two effects. It would either blow up in the user's face, causing little to serious bodily harm depending on how many characters are drawn, or it will act like a dud explosion tag and fizzle out until the paper was nothing but ashes. In this particular situation, the explosion is what occurred, but not in the outside world. Once the demon was secured inside the new Jinchuriki, an explosion occurred in the alternate space within the boy, causing a tear in the very fabric of space and time and pulling the confused and distressed Kyuubi through the black hole. After said hole fully devoured what was once known as the most powerful bijou in the elemental nations, it closed unceremoniously, leaving the space the Kyuubi once inhabited as void as it was created. However, just before the tear in space and time closed, a small figure fell through the crack and landed softly on its back. The figure looked to be a young girl with parakeet green hair that went all the way down to the back of her shins. If anyone were to gaze at the girl that seemed to be peacefully sleeping on the ground, then they would notice three very important aspects of her character. The first would be that she was as naked as the day she was born. The second would be the fact her ears were longer and pointier than any human had a right to be. The third, and most prominent, would be the war-looking weapon she held tightly to her chest. It was a double-edged blade that had the pointed edge of a blade, but had the fuller design like a human spine with cracks and all, and seemed to be longer than the girl herself. The guard of the blade resembled that of dragon wings, while the rain guard was wide and had a hole in the center. The last notable thing about the blade would be the shocking fact it was glowing and fading red as lava, as if mimicking the heartbeat of its current holder. In this dimension, no one knows of the little girl that now slept peacefully within the Jinchuriki of Konohagakure no Sato. But in a completely different dimension and time, this girl was widely known as the Pillar of the World and one who is known throughout every church in the kingdom of Fodlan. This one switch between one godly being and a demonic fox would change the course of history and the life of one Uzumaki Naruto. For better or for worse? That has yet to be seen. Naruto 3 years old, July 13th. He call. The first time Naruto heard the creepy voice, he was scared. It came out in bits and pieces and it was extremely hard to understand. But his little mind was too focused on the fear of something he couldn't see talking to him to worry about the fact the ghost was speaking in a language he didn't yet know. He had tried many times to tell the adults that something was following him around, but the mean orphanage people wouldn't believe him. As time went by, the voice began to get louder and louder no matter what he did to get away from it. He tried hiding under his covers at night, but the blanket never protected him. He tried going into groups of other kids, no matter how much the meanies say he can't play with them, but that only seemed to annoy the ghost more. He tried telling the adults again, but they would just punish him for no reason like they always do. It wasn't until a week went by that he finally got the courage to speak to the ghost terrorizing him. To his surprise, the voice spoke right back to him, and he could somewhat understand what it was saying. The words kept coming back in jumbled sentences and he could barely understand a word, but he learned that the more he talked to it, the more he was starting to understand it. Single words turned into sentences, and sentences eventually turned into paragraphs. At first, he really didn't like the ghost. It kept calling him names like Idoid, Buffoon and other mean names he didn't understand. But the little praise gave him occasionally more than made up for it, and, for once in his life, he felt happy. Unlike the adults and other kids, it actually listened when he talked. It helped him when he didn't understand something. However reluctantly, it cheered him up, tried, when he was down, and it scolded him whenever he did or said anything stupid, as in tear his ear off until he understood what he did or said wrong. It never held that same hateful tone the adults had for him, and it began teaching him things that he would never have been able to learn from anyone else. The only downside to the ghost was it was always sleepy, like really sleepy. It would always nod off during their conversations and he wouldn't hear from it again till the next day, couple of days, or even weeks. Those days were lonely, but whenever Ghost Sam was back, it would have his full attention. The ghost was a lot of things, very smart, mean at times, a slob, and a total loner, but it was a friend. Yeah, a friend, his first friend. Naruto 4 years old, December 21st. It had been an entire month since the orphanage had kicked him out. At first, he was really angry and wanted nothing more than to scream and hurt all those unfair and mean adults. But his only friend stopped him. Instead, he let it go and was forced to survive by eating the trash out of garbage bins or whatever he could successfully steal from shops. It was a hard life and the cold didn't make it any better, but he truly believed that as long as he had Ghost San by his side, then anywhere in the world would be home. Speaking of his only friend, it was currently sleeping once again while he walked through the dark streets of Konoha. Unfortunately for him, the alley he had been sleeping in for the past few weeks were guarded by angry civilians that he once stole from. He had absolutely no intention of knowing what they would do to him with those bats and pitchforks, so he decided it would be a good idea to find somewhere else to sleep for the night. It's not like that was the only alleyway in Konoha anyways, right? It was as he was walking to another alley ahead of him that he was forced to stop. The blonde's eyes widened when he saw a black figure turn his direction, while holding a small bundle over his shoulder. Now, Naruto have seen many ninja in the village. Most tended to ignore him, which was good considering he would never make it on the streets if they chased him down. But every last one of them had one thing in common. Every one of them had a headband that signified Konohagakure no Sato. This man, however, had no headband at all, and from the bundle that seemed to be moving on his shoulder, Naruto immediately knew this ninja was not one of Konoha's. After coming to that quick conclusion, he immediately opened his mouth to scream for anyone that could come and help. Before he could even get any air out of his throat, he suddenly heard a very weird and nasty sound ring through his ears. It was followed by an intense pain he'd never felt before in his life and air refusing to come out of his throat. He stumbled back before he felt his entire body get colder, and he fell to his back. He tried opening his mouth to scream for someone to stop the pain he was feeling, but all that came out was this nasty metallic taste that kept escaping his mouth. Panicking, he tried begging Ghost-san for help, but there was no answer. He tried moving his body but could only move his arms to the place that was hurting so much. He felt something sticking out of his throat, but he couldn't pull it out, and it was as he was desperately trying to remove the thing that was causing him so much pain that he realized something number 5-year-old should ever realize. He was dying. He was dying alone where no one would help him, and he was dying before he could truly experience the life he didn't really even know. Despite knowing that his end was coming, he couldn't help but think of his one and only friend. If he was gone, who would Ghost-san talk to? Who would Ghost-san scold now? Would Ghost-san even miss him if he were gone? What would happen to Ghost-san if he was gone? Tears and other liquids were pouring down his face as he realized he would be leaving this world and his only friend far too early. As his body began to go numb, and his eyes began closing, he could only think of one thing. I want to leave. And as if answering the only wish he had ever had, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the world and a purple haze covered the elemental nations and the world beyond. Naruto stopped on his walk to the alley and suddenly jerked before taking in deep breaths as if they'd be his last. He felt extremely dizzy and couldn't stop himself from falling to his knees while quivering uncontrollably. His hand absent-mindedly came to his neck as if expecting it to no longer be there. A second later images invaded his head and bile along with the little he had eaten that day emptied from his stomach to the pavement. After emptying his stomach of all its contents, he got control of his dry heaving and stood to shaky legs. What happened? He asked no one as he looked forward. A shiver suddenly went up his spine as he looked to the alley that was just 50 yards in front of him. Visions suddenly assaulted his mind and he had to stop himself from throwing up again as he remembered the black figure throw something through his neck. Hide now, you idiotic child. Quickly, before your fate is renewed. He didn't have time to question the distorted voice of his only friend since his body was too busy subconsciously following orders, taking cover in the bushes conveniently to his left. He made sure not to move as he peeked through the leaves obstructing his view. Moments later, his heart nearly stopped when he saw the same black figure once again running towards him. Not a sound left his lips this time as he watched the figure run closer and closer to him. Thankfully, this time he ran right past his hiding place and down the path he had previously been coming from. The blonde didn't even have time to feel relieved since the second his eyes followed the black-clad ninja. Said ninja was falling to the floor in a boneless heap as another man in a white robe had a palm outstretched to where the ninja's chest used to be. Many things happened after that. More people in robes and Konoha shinobi gear appeared and even new shinobi wearing strange animal masks appeared to take the body away. They were there for a good 15 minutes before everyone cleared out. He could swear the white-robed man that saved the girl in the bundle was looking his direction before he too left with the little girl Naruto's age that was once wrapped in the bundle. Only when he was sure everyone was gone did he leave the bushes and run as far away from that place as possible. What he experienced that night, and what he saw would give him horrifying nightmares for the next few months. Naruto 5 years old, May 3rd. Naruto held up his rusted kunai as he slowly backed away from the old man blocking his way out of the alley. He had only stopped for a second to check his steal of the day, but it would seem that second was his downfall, since the moment he was about to eat the bread he had stolen, a shadow covered him completely, and he turned to see this old man wearing white robes and a strange hat was blocking his way. He didn't look like much, and Naruto was sure he could outrun this old fart, but something deep inside him told him that this old man was strong, crazy strong, and the smile the old man kept giving him only made his nerves that much more jittery. I see the spirit of a fighter is strong with you, young one. The wrinkly old man chuckled as he got closer to the blonde, who backed away unconsciously. Oh ho ho, please don't be so fearful, child. I can promise you this old man has no ulterior motives. I just wish to talk to you honest. The way the old man spoke and the smile on his face would have normally reassured most children. But Naruto Uzumaki wasn't a normal kid. After living on the streets for more than 6 months, he had learned that the only one he could trust was himself and Ghost-san. Anyone else always took advantage of him, and he always paid for it in the end. He still bore one particular mental scar from a shinobi he once trusted, and after that event, he swore never again would people take advantage of him. This wrinkly old man was no doubt the same. Tell you what, if you sit down with me for only a couple of minutes, I'll let you wear my special hat. How does that sound to you? Naruto only raised an eyebrow as he looked to the hat on the old man's head. The only thing the blonde could find unique about the hat was the single kanji on the front of it that was surrounded by white, while the rest of the hat was red. Since he couldn't read well, he didn't know what the symbol on the hat stood for, and it only made the blonde think even less of it. What's so special about it? It's just a stupid hat, the blonde grumbled, surprisingly getting a wider smile from the much older male. Ah, but this is a very special hat, the old man said as he removed said hat from his head, revealing his gray locks to the world. Tell me, son, do you know what a shinobi is? Naruto didn't know where the old man was going with this, but he nodded slowly anyways. They protect the village from bad people, and kill those who hurt others, the blonde said, having flashbacks to the night the man in white robes killed that bad enemy ninja. The old man simply nodded at the blonde's answer. That is somewhat correct, my boy, but there is more to a shinobi's life than that, the old man said as he looked fondly at the hat in his hands. Then he began speaking fondly, soundly like a record that has repeated the same song over and over again. A shinobi's job is to defend their homeland from threats both inside and out. A shinobi is someone who is willing to risk their lives for their home and the people within it. A shinobi is one who trains relentlessly to protect the things and people they care about and open a future for the home they are protecting. A shinobi is one who willingly goes through days of torture to keep the secrets of their home away from enemy hands, even if it kills them in the end. He then sighed longingly as this look came across his face that the blonde could not understand. The words that came out next was almost a whisper, for the true measure of a shinobi is not how he lives, but how he dies. It's not what they do in life, but what they did before dying that proves their worth. Naruto didn't realize he had fallen out of his battle stance as he began getting more and more engrossed in the old man's words. This hat is a symbol that you understand and uphold the shinobi code. The one who wears this hat is not only viewed as a true shinobi, but also holds the power and allegiance of all Konoha shinobi. In other words, this hat is the symbol that you have not only been acknowledged as the strongest ninja in the village, but have achieved the peak of a shinobi's career in Konohagakure no Sato. Naruto couldn't remember the last time he was this excited about something in his life. He had seen the cool ninja before throughout the village and would embarrassingly admit he has mimicked some of the cool things they do when he was alone, but he never thought how cool and important their jobs really were. And this old man in front of him was at the top. He had gained the respect and acknowledgement of everyone in the village just by wearing that hat. He wanted to wear that hat. He wanted people to stop looking at him so hatefully, and look at him like the old man before him now was. If he had that hat, then people would finally acknowledge him for who he is. They'll have to respect him then. He didn't realize he was reaching out to the hat that was being held out in front of him until the old man suddenly pulled it away and placed it back on his head. It is unfortunate, but I can clearly see you aren't interested in such a profession, the old man said sorrowfully as he turned to leave. I guess I'll be taking my Leah. No! The smile on the old man's face returned when he saw the boy looking at him with a frantic expression on his face, yet, a second later, He seemed to have realized just how desperate he looked and coughed into his hand. Seeing the boy try to keep his image made the old shinobi nearly chuckle. I have an interest in being a shinobi, so, The old man had to stop himself from laughing at the clear embarrassment the boy was showing in asking for something he clearly wanted. Who knew a 5-year-old already had pride? He didn't stay sheepish for long, however, since a second later he gathered his wits and shouted right at him. Please tell me more about the Hokage, Jiji-san. If possible, the smile on the old man's face became even wider. Tell me, son, have you ever had ramen? Naruto, 6 years old. October 10th. Naruto stood still in the middle of a 4-way intersection. It was one of the only streets of Konoha that was not currently lit with fancy lanterns or decorations for the yearly Kyuubi festival. However, this day was special for Naruto since it was not only the day the Kyuubi was defeated by the Yondaime Hokage, but also his birthday. Now, normally kids his age would be celebrating with friends or family for the only day in the year where you can be thankful for the day you were born. However, Naruto was not one of those kids. In fact, he hated his birthday since it was one of the days of the year where angry and drunk people actively hunted him down like he was a raging animal that needed to be slain, even if he gave them good reason to do so. That, however, did not mean he didn't celebrate his birthday. Okami no. He celebrated his birthday every year a month early with Ghost-san. The only difference between this year and the other 3 he celebrated was the fact Hokage Jiji and the nice ramen stand people all gave him gifts that he now had hidden in the apartment Hokage Jiji happily gave him. He wouldn't lie, the gifts they gave him were pretty good and he would treasure them for as long as they last. But it was the gift Ghost-san gave him a month ago that completely trumped anything the other 3 most important people in his life could ever give him. It was as he was thinking about the gift that he realized people were finally starting to turn 3 of the 4 corners on the street, like he was expecting. It was a group of angry villagers he had very recently stolen from, or others who were there for other nefarious reasons. Within seconds, he was completely surrounded. Yet his mask of indifference stayed present even after looking at the sneers on faces of the people surrounding him. Nowhere to run, you little demon! One of the angry villagers yelled as they all began to close in. You guys seem angry, Naruto pointed out the obvious with a tilt of his head. That only seemed to make the people surrounding him angrier, and a second later the first civilian, an old woman the blonde remembered stealing fruit daily from for kicking him out for no reason, came charging in with a torch and ready to use it like a mace. The boy did nothing but watch every movement of the woman as she raised up the torch and brought it straight down to meet his emotionless face. Then suddenly, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the village and the entire world stood still. Quite literally, everything animal, human, insect and item stood frozen in a distorted purple haze that touched every inch of the elemental nations and beyond. The only living being in the world unfazed by this unnatural phenomenon was the blonde that was now curiously looking up to the fire that was only a few centimeters away from his face with new glowing seafoam eyes. He raised his hand and grabbed the torch that was once unfrozen by time out of the woman's hand. The torch, once frozen in time, suddenly came back to life with all its fiery glory. He stared at the torch for a second before staring back at the woman who had tried burning his face off. Without hesitation, he casually tossed the torch into the woman's face and watched as the wood first splintered before the fire completely engulfed the old bat. The fire spread over the woman's figure for only a second before it too became frozen by time once again. I wonder what your screams would sound like. Maybe then we could understand each other, he thought darkly. But as he expected, nothing happened. No burn, no reaction from the one now on fire, nothing. He knew why, but he could never get used to the feeling of the world itself standing still at just a simple thought. The things he could and would do to the people that wronged him always threatened to take over his mind. However, Ghost-san would have none of that. She had warned him that just like she gave him the power, she could just as easily take it away, and he was not too keen on pissing off his only real friend, even if that meant he had to suppress his darker thoughts. It was the least he could do for the one who had technically raised him for the past 2 years, and hearing its disappointment was far scarier than anything these people could say or do to him. Ever since the day that strange ninja killed him, he has been eagerly using the power given to him by his best and only friend. After he had ran to safety that day, Ghost-san had told him all about what had happened and the fact it had basically saved his life. The moment those words left its mouth, he wanted to hug the voice so bad that tears poured out of his eyes for the second time that day in his whole life. Now, almost a year later, Ghost-san was still protecting him by using its power whenever his plan to steal food went wrong or when the civilians cornered him and nearly did very bad and painful things to him. Then Ghost-san taught him how to use its power, and he has loved it ever since. But alas, every power comes with a price. After using it multiple times, he soon learned that 7 times in a day is his limit. He had tried using it more once, but it ended up strangely draining his stamina dry and he had to spend a week in the hospital since he couldn't move a muscle. Thankfully, Hokage came to visit every day and left some of his animal friends behind to make sure he was safe from the stupid villagers. The other thing he learned quickly was the more he used it, the more Ghost-san slept. One time, he used it every day for a week and Ghost-san didn't speak again for an entire 3 months. Those months were single-handedly the coldest and scariest of his life and he swore to use Ghost-san's abilities sparingly from that day onward. The last con of this time-stopping ability was the fact he couldn't disrupt anyone frozen in time and however far back he wanted to go, he would have to follow. For instance, this stopped him from stopping time and moving yards in front of someone and starting time again. He had tried and would always end up wherever he was when time began again at that point of time. Ghost-san tried explaining it once, but it got really angry when he didn't fully understand the big words and fancy sentences it was using to explain to him. All in all, he loved this power, and he loved the one who gave it to him more. Back to the present, with just a thought, the people around him began walking in reverse while Naruto stayed where he had been for the past 10 minutes. He sped up the process and watched as the bodies ran backwards slowly and into the corridors they came from. After making sure he had rewind time back far enough, with another thought the purple haze slowly phased out and he was once again alone in the clearing. Naruto grinned happily as he put his arms behind his head and walked down the only path the civilians didn't appear. He kept the rare smile on his face as he continued to use his gift to make it all the way to his apartment, not passing a soul along the way. Naruto 7 years old, November 1st, Academy Year 1. We are training to be shinobi. Why should I care whether or not I fight fair? Naruto asked in genuine confusion despite the plastic stare he was giving his scar-faced academy teacher, Iruka Yumino. The scar-faced man could only sigh and rub the bridge of his nose. He would be angrier at the boy's oblivious attitude if he hadn't dealt with this exact situation many times in the past. The boy genuinely didn't understand what he did wrong and it was up to Iruka to try and explain, once again, something he thought was common sense. Naruto, the point of the exercise is for me to grade you on your taijutsu skills, though your reasoning is logical, and I truly applaud you for your train of thought. It sadly defeats the whole purpose of the exercise if you don't follow the kata you were taught. Iruka did his best to not turn and look at his assistant teacher, Mizuki, who was on the ground cradling his family jewels while trying to rub away the dirt that had been thrown in his eyes. Iruka couldn't help but thank Kami he wasn't the one demonstrating kata today. That punch to the balls from the 7-year-old looked really painful. Naruto blinked up at his teacher before tilting his head in confusion, but Jisen said a shinobi should always take advantage of opportunities, training or no. That's true, but, and you once told us that shinobi must do whatever they must to survive. Yes, I did, however. Then why does it matter if I cheat too? I know it doesn't matter objectively. Just follow the dam. The instructor stopped himself and clenched a fist before he took in a breath to calm down. Yelling at the blonde would get him nowhere. The kid was absolutely right in his way of thinking, but he clearly didn't understand the meaning of the phrase a time and place. The only thing he could think to do in the future was be very specific when teaching this particular troublesome student of his. Oh joy. Look, Naruto, please, just follow the kata like you were taught. You are correct. But the only way we can grade you on what you've learned is if we personally see it. Going outside the assignment parameters defeats the whole purpose of the test. But Iruka-sensei, you said, do the damn kata. Naruto stared back at his teacher with that same impassive look before turning back to the now recovered Mizuki and getting into a stance that seemed awkward to the blonde, restarting the spar. Iruka frowned the longer it went on. Naruto was performing the kata as told, but the technique and execution of every strike seemed to be off in one way or another. Where one would usually transition to another move when blocking or attacking, Naruto performed it as if trying to connect different segments together to make it work. No surprise. It didn't work, and it only ended up leaving huge gaps in the young shinobi in training's guard that was life-threatening. He didn't know why he was doing it, but it was quite uncharacteristic for a student as bright, if not a bit too straightforward, as the Uzumaki to not soak up the kata Mizuki teaches him like a sponge the way he does the rest of his work. It would just have to be something he brought to the blonde's attention in the future. Seeing enough, Iruka called the match. However, while Naruto dropped his guard, Mizuki continued the assault with a sneer that Iruka would only acknowledge after the event that was about to occur. The Chunin's leg came up in a roundhouse kick that went unseen by the turning blonde. From the speed and the angle the kick was coming at, Iruka was sure only disastrous results would come if that kick connected. Not even with all his speed as a Chunin could aid him in stopping what he knew was going to be lethal. His fears were confirmed when a sickening snap echoed through the school grounds and young Uzumaki Naruto was sent flying until another snap was when the boy's head smashed into the tree bark. There was but a second of silence before horrified screams echoed from the children watching. Iruka was immediately at Naruto's side and almost emptied his stomach at the eyes that stared into the distance without an hint of light. He barely registered his best friend frantically cursing aloud before it followed by the sound of a sword leaving its sheath and a wet splat silencing him and emitted more screams from the kids. He barely registered the shadow of multiple ANBU standing over him. He barely registered someone speaking to him before others tried taking his now dead student from his crash. Seeing enough, Iruka called the match. However, while Naruto dropped his guard, Mizuki continued the assault with a sneer that Iruka would only acknowledge after the event that was about to occur. The Chunin's leg came up in a roundhouse kick that went unseen by the turning blonde. From the speed and the angle the kick was coming in, Iruka was sure only disastrous results would come if that kick was connected, and not even with all his speed as a Chunin could aid him in stopping what he knew would be lethal. However, what actually happened was not something the instructor, or anyone for that matter, was expecting at all. Almost in slow motion, Iruka saw the blonde duck as if knowing the kick was coming, then reached into his back pocket and quickly popped something into his mouth. The blonde then stood up with a lighter, of all things, open in his hand and took in a deep breath. The unaware Mizuki had already made a full 360 degrees and was now looking back at the blonde who stared back with puffed cheeks. A second later, Iruka's, and nearly everyone in the class, jaw dropped as a stream of fire escaped the blonde's mouth and completely engulfed the sky-blue-haired Chunin. Mizuki let out a cry of anguish as he tried patting out the flames that didn't last longer than a few seconds. If things couldn't get any worse for the man, the second the blonde stopped spewing flames, he dashed right in front of the panicked Chunin and jumped into the air with his legs drawn back. Then he kicked forward with all his strength and into, once again, the balls of the screeching Chunin. The older male was launched off his feet and out of their makeshift arena wall that was nothing more than a circle on the ground. Naruto looked down at the whimpering Chunin once again cradling his balls before looking back to Iruka-sensei. The teacher's mouth hung agape along with half the class as the blonde just tilted his head. He was open. Iruka could only slowly tap his clipboard repeatedly against his forehead, while the rest of the class laughed. No one saw the cold look in the blonde's eyes as he glanced down at his instructor before rejoining the rest of his class. A month later, an investigation was made on Mizuki for suspicion of treason. An anonymous source had delivered heavy evidence of sabotage of one Naruto Uzumaki. On further investigation, it was shown that not only had he been sabotaging Naruto, but the entire school by altering curriculum and slowly lowering the quality of textbooks and stealing from school funding. Multiple letters written from an unknown source was found in his home while he was in captivity. The letters confirmed that he was being given orders by an outside source that had not yet been identified. He was trialed and found guilty a week later. That same day, he was executed for treason and the Shinobi Academy went through some changes. The curriculum were back in order and many shinobi in training quit from the increase in their training and studies. This event would turn out to the betterment of Konoha as a whole, and it was all thanks to the anonymous individual for smoking out their little traitor. Naruto 8 years old, August 1st. If anyone would ask Naruto what his social life was like, then he'd probably tell you it consisted of 2 old men, a girl 5 years his senior, his teacher, and a voice in his head. Not that he'd tell anyone the last one considering the ramifications of said confession. In his defense, it's not that he hadn't tried gaining friends in the past. He had tried gaining friends his age many times in the orphanage, but they would all scorn him the second his name was even mentioned because of the caretakers. He had saved a pink-haired girl once, and she actually played with him up until the time her mother came and told her she wanted her nowhere near him ever again, in the academy. He just had no need to speak to the rest of the kids because either their parents told them not to, or they were not able to keep a steady conversation with him due to his advanced way of speaking molded into his mind thanks to conversing with a being in his head that could verbally insult you in ways you wouldn't understood unless you had a dictionary. That being said, there was a particular event that stopped all chances of ever getting friends in his class. Flashback. It was lunchtime and Naruto had been present in the class along with about 9 other students that either decided to eat in the class or forgot to bring their lunch. Instead of eating, he had been working on a fuinjutsu tag that would seal his windows and doors while he was out. It was a tough seal to make, but was one of the only seals he could make in the class that didn't have nearly as much blast power behind it if something went wrong. The worst that would happen if a mistake were to occur would be the tag would knock him out of his seat and everyone around him would laugh. Probably a problem for the other kids, but nothing to someone who didn't care about his social image. He was just about to draw the finishing touches into the paper when something smashed violently into the back of his head so hard it made the blonde smash his face into the desk and into the seal he was creating. The ink he was using splashed over the paper and, like he said, a force blasted him off his chair and into the wall behind him. Maybe a little more force due to the amount of ink on the paper. But details, the classroom that was once filled with childish chatter became dead silent at the commotion. Then laughter broke out from the kids Naruto could only assume were the perpetrators from the unprovoked attack. Ha 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 ha. Whoops. My hand slipped. Naruto immediately recognized the kid as the class civilian bully. The bully who didn't get good grades, was average at taijutsu, and only put others down with his group of friends because they hated the clan kids. Or they were, in a word, pricks, however. They normally left him alone and Naruto had no reason to interact with the waste of shinobi tax dollars. This was the first time they openly did something against him, and he had to give them credit for going in hard or going home. Slowly raising himself from the ground, ink flowing down his face like blood from a wound, Naruto turned his head to the object that had assaulted him. It was a brown tetherball that looked all too similar to the one that was supposed to be at the playground. Why they had it? The blonde honestly didn't want to know. Getting up from his seat, he slowly walked over, picked up the tetherball, and calmly walked back to the ones who were now standing with smirks on their faces as if daring the blonde to say something they didn't want to hear. Luckily for them, Naruto wasn't one to lash out childishly. He knew that they knew anything he did to them physically would just end up with them crying to the teachers and said teachers taking their side without even listening to his story. I believe you dropped this. Naruto held out the tetherball to the bullies who looked taken back from the blonde's lack of attitude. The one closest to the blonde hesitantly reached out to grab the ball and looked almost confused when the blonde simply walked away. That interaction would have, and should have, been the end of it. The blonde would walk away and not retaliate to the obvious bait to rile him up. They would let this go and that would be the end of it. It would seem his thoughts were all wishful thinking because not even 5 steps to his chair something impacted the back of his head once again and sent him to the ground. Once again, the bullies were laughing, and Naruto had his face planted into another hard surface. For a second time, Naruto slowly picked himself up, grabbed the tetherball and was back in front of the bullies whose grins were downright malicious. Sorry, just can't control my hands nowadays, it was an accident. Honestly, Naruto showed no emotion as he looked to the slightly taller boy smirking down at him. It would seem he made an error of judgment. He had thought not showing aggression would dissuade the bully from taking any further action since it seemed to work with the adults. But he forgot this person was not of the same maturity as the people he had dealt with in the past. He would have to fix that. Consequences or no. He held out the ball for the boy to take and was not surprised by the snarl on the bully's face. However, when the boy went to yank the ball out of the Uzumaki's hands, he found that it stuck to the blonde's hands like glue. It wouldn't budge and no matter how much he pulled, he couldn't remove or move the blank-faced blonde. Hey! Let it go, you freak! The boy yelled, but got no response from the blonde. Did you know that there are over 200 bones in the human body? The blonde asked as if he was asking the weather. What I find more fascinating than the number is the fact that every bone can be as hard as steel if they are aided by calcium and other vitamins while the body grows. I don't care, freak. Just give me my damn ball already. I didn't really believe this until I tested it in person, the Uzumaki continued unperturbed. Much to my surprise, I found that bones were, indeed, as hard as steel, so hard in fact that if sharpened, there would be no difference between it and a normal steel sword or kunai. The bully suddenly went quiet at the blonde's words. In fact, they worked so well that I made multiple weapons out of said bones. Be it animal or human, I used their remains to make an entire collection of weapons and various other tools for my everyday needs. I find it to be tough work, but I am good at making the best out the little I am given. That being said, my supply has diminished somewhat over the past weeks due to the increase in studying and training I've had to undergo. Suddenly, the room felt a lot colder. The blonde stopped and stared directly into the eyes of the boy before him with his now seafoam eyes that sent shivers up his and the bully's spines. So, if your hands just so happen to slip again, faster than a kid his age should be capable, the blonde's hand shot out and stabbed something into the ball in the boy's hand. The ball deflated while the boy holding it fell down to his rear in fright. He looked to the deflated ball and his eyes went wide from the white tool that looked like a sharpened bone sticking out from the now useless piece of leather. Shakily looking back up, he and his friends were met with the cold stare of the boy they thought they could take on together. They were wrong, very, very wrong. I will permanently remove them from your body and use the bones as my future kunai. On a good note, since that day, no one ever tried bullying him again. On a bad note, his reputation had dropped even further than even he had predicted, and no one ever approached him again unless it was life and death. And in their minds, that's what it would be. Flashback end. Despite the outcome of that encounter a year ago, he still believed that was the best course of action. Not only did others leave his to his devices, but it gave him more time to work on his shinobi skills and talk to Ghost-san. In his mind, who needed friends when you had one as great as Ghost-san anyways? Now, at 9 years old and a year higher than his former peers and supposed bullies, he was now a grade higher than most of his peers. He would have been even higher. But due to the Uchiha massacre in which Itachi Uchiha massacred his entire clan to test his abilities, there were no more grade skipping for anyone, genius or no. Some say the Uchiha snapped under the duties he must have had as the village's youngest AMBU captain. Some say he fell due to the cursed hatred born every member of the Uchiha clan. Some even say he was a sleeper agent for another village put in to weaken Konoha. Either way, thanks to the Uchiha, he put a damper on the blonde's plan for graduating the next year. A small setback. But that just meant he had more time to sharpen his skills before actually going to the field. However, that did not mean he had to like his current situation. For the past month he'd had to continue sitting in a class he found boring and useless to his future duties as a shinobi. Everything he's learned over the years were outside the school grounds, and even after being in this new class for a month, nothing has changed for him mental or social-wise. He got the odd stare and glare from people who didn't even know him. But that was normal and was put to the back of his mind. The one person he thought would understand him was a Hyuga by the name of Niji. But he was, if he could put it in a way his former classmate Kiba would say, a dick, didn't even acknowledge him when he approached. It probably didn't help either, since the next day he threw a flashbang tag in the Hyuga's eyes to win the taijutsu test. In fact, he went from unapproachable to downright hostile after that little stunt. Wasn't his fault the Hyuga and the rest of the class didn't understand there was no rules when it came down to a fight. Nevertheless, that was fine with the Uzumaki. He had been a loner for the year he had attended the academy already. What was another 4 years to him? That's why you will have to understand the shock he was feeling from the bun-haired girl currently smiling down at him during their lunch break. She was wearing a Chinese-style sleeveless orange shirt with baggy black-blue pants and shinobi sandals. She was about his height, and, if he could remember correctly, her name was Benton? Tenben? Something like that. Anyways, from what he knew about her, her taijutsu was just as average as his. But she excelled at shuriken jutsu and was the only one in the class capable of throwing kunai better than Niji and himself. Not the most sociable of girls, but she wasn't really unapproachable either. She's currently the kunoichi of the year and a shoo-in to graduate on her first try. What someone like her was doing standing before him, he could only imagine. Hey there, Uzumaki-kun. Mind if I sit here? Naruto didn't know what to say to the chipper girl, so he just nodded and watched as she sat down right next to him. She continued to smile as she watched him continue the seal he was currently working on to keep himself occupied. About a minute went by before the bun-haired girl decided to be the one to start up a conversation. Susu, what you working on? Naruto stopped for a second before replying in his usual monotone, a seal. What kind of seal? An important seal. What kind of important seal? The blonde looked away from his work and to the prying girl with furrowed brows and suspicion. I am under no obligation to provide you with that information, Benton-san. The girl's eye twitched, but raised her hands in a placating manner. Sorry, didn't mean to pry, just really wanted to know what kind of seal you were working on is all. The bun-haired girl tried her best to keep the smile on her face, but it was hard when she couldn't decipher the emotion on the face of the individual she was currently trying to strike up a conversation with. Naruto Uzumaki, a prodigy in his own right, was someone she'd never even thought of approaching. In the month he had been here, he hadn't spoken to a single person and, in the beginning, was regularly called out in class by Shitori-sensei for working on other projects during her lessons. She was sure the only reason the teacher never really punished him was because he seemed to get every single question asked of him right. Soon, the teacher stopped calling on him altogether, seeing that he was clearly, somehow, still paying attention despite his eyes and hands being occupied by other tasks. The kunoichi in training didn't really care what he was working on in the beginning until yesterday, when she caught a glimpse of exactly what it was he was working on. She could still remember first the confusion of the scribbles written on the thin piece of paper, then the excitement that went through her body when she recognized some of the characters. He was working on Fuinjutsu, and from the complicated characters she could see on the paper, he was in the advanced stages, far above her own. At that moment, she felt as if she had found a kindred spirit among her peers, and she just had to get the Uzumaki to tell her more about the art she heavily sought after. Meanwhile, completely different thoughts were going on in the blonde's head. To the average shinobi, Tenten's persistence would immediately draw red flags. Just her demeanor alone leaked suspicion, and could be pointed out even by a toddler. Her smile was too big for someone she had never spoken to. Her posture showed submissiveness, and her tone was so bland it might as well have been plastic. She wanted something, and she wasn't really the best at hiding it. That was okay. She was a growing shinobi in training and still had 4 years to master the art of deception before she graduated and was on the field. However, the circumstances and timing of which the girl's curiosity sparked was what put the young Uzumaki on edge more than her obvious ulterior motives. You mean to tell him that the day he decides to change the expired barrier formula for his home is the same day she grows interested in seals, while at the same time she just so happened to talk to him when he's working on it? Well, Uzumaki Naruto was born overnight, but not last night, and could see through these childish games of sabotage in his sleep. Ignoring the chuckles that echoed through his head, he interrogated the kunoichi in training to find her true motives. And what exactly would you do with that information, Benton-san? The girl's eye twitch became more noticeable over her confusion at the question. For all I know, you could use what I tell you to break through the defenses at my home and kill me when I am asleep. Or you could use what I tell you to sell off to other shinobi to do the dirty work for you, washing your hands of any future suspicion if the shinobi in question never got caught. Sorry, Benton-san, but I see through your plans and your attempts on my life will not bear fruit. Tenten could not help the dumbfounded look on her face. Her jaw hung agape and her brain went blank as it replayed everything in her mind. What the I am 9. Who in their right mind thinks like that at that age? And my name is Tenten, stupid. 10. Looking nonplussed at the girl's outburst, Naruto replied dryly, We are training to be shinobi, Tenten-san. Paranoia comes with the job description. Said paranoia has kept me alive for all these years and has helped me improve myself as a future shinobi. If anything, you do not fear enough, and that shows bad qualities for a future shinobi. Tenten gawked at the blonde before a sneer appeared on her face, and she stomped the ground angrily. What's that supposed to mean? You calling me a bad shinobi, you blonde loner? Naruto seemed to frown as he thought over the brunette's words. A second later he bowed slightly to the brunette. Much to the confusion of the bun-haired girl, Forgive me. It was not my intention to berate your line of profession. I simply thought it wise of me to point out the flaws in your thought process when pursuing a career as treacherous as the one we both willingly enlisted in. I meant no disrespect by my words and hope you can forgive me for my offense. Tenten couldn't say anything to the blonde's apology. More like, she couldn't really understand half the words used in that sentence, and it showed from the strained look on her face. I didn't understand half those words. I know you're some kind of genius, but you can't make me believe you talk like that to everyone. The blonde had to blink in confusion at the brunette's words. Why wouldn't I speak like this to everyone? I thought my vocabulary was relatively normal. Is there perhaps another way of speaking that I was not privy to till now? No. Just stop talking like that. Please elaborate, Tenten-san. Like that. The blonde's confusion began showing on his face the angrier the girl got. You have me at a disadvantage. I do not understand your. That right there. Just. UGH, stop using big words. You're hurting my brain, dang it. Tenten had to calm herself before she tore her hair out. Unlike the time she spoke to Niji, the resident stuck-up prodigy prick, this kid genuinely seemed to lack the social norms every kid his age should be privy to. Great. Now she's even talking like him. Just look, I'ma keep it simple. No. And I mean no, normal kid talks the way you talk to some people. It makes them see you as stuck up, while others find it hard to keep a conversation. How do any of your friends keep a steady conversation with you when you talk like you're just picking random words from a dictionary? I see. I did not know my vocabulary was too advanced for my peers. I will see to it to dumb down my vocabulary in our future conversations to fit the social norm. Deep breaths, Tenten. He didn't mean it. He has the sociability of a brick. Deep breaths. However, I do find that task more work than it is worth. For one, I do not have acquaintances my age. Most who I converse with are of older age and understand me more than my peers ever have. They are few in numbers, but do not admonish me for the way I act. Accept me for who I am, and do not talk down to me as if I'm not their equal, though I am of younger age. I find their company more comforting and enjoyable than I've ever had amongst my peers. Tenten honestly didn't know what to say to that. He was younger than her, yet those eyes and those words did not belong to someone her age. To have no one your age who understands you had to have been lonely, right? She didn't honestly have many friends, but the few she could honestly call friends and the only older one she could think of was her father. Maybe that's why he was always alone, because others didn't understand him? Really, what a stupid reason to isolate someone who, she believed, was just misunderstood. Wow, that's kinda sad. The blonde shook his head. Please do not show pity on my behalf. Though my precious ones are low, I do my best to cherish the ones I have and would not trade them for the world. If anyone else has a problem with the way I am, then they are not worthy of my time. Wow, way to bring down the mood. Exactly what was she supposed to say to that? Tenten has seen sad people before, the Hyuga princess being at the top of that list, but this kid, despite his isolation, genuinely feels the way he feels with no remorse. In fact, despite the way she would feel in his situation, she could see no hint of a lie or loneliness, and it just felt so wrong. Then an idea suddenly struck the bun-haired girl, an idea so genius to her 9-year-old mind that it would be beneficial for both her and this poor soul. Then how about this? She declared, standing to her feet while pointing down at the blonde smugly. From today onward, I, Tenten Higurashi, am going to be your first real friend. I will teach you the do's and don'ts of being a human being while also teaching you the various social norms that you obviously need in your life. In exchange, you are going to teach me Fuinjutsu, train with me every day after school, and be my target practice buddy from here on. What? She had to think about herself as well. There was no way she was going to do this and not get anything out of it. It's called equivalent exchange, people. Equivalent exchange. So, what ya say? Good deal, right? No, it was not a good deal, and Naruto didn't need a calculator to see who benefited more in this little mutual exchange. I do not find this to be a good deal, right? And that day, Naruto Uzumaki found his first, real friend. And what in creator's name am I, child? A phantom of the mind? Emphasis on real. Naruto 9 years old, May 17th. This time you've completely gone too far. An angry Irika roared, a vein ready to pop on his forehead as he stood next to an unmoved Naruto Uzumaki, a Hokage gradually taking deep puffs from his pipe, and a voice in the blonde's head laughing hysterically. I am confused, Hokage-sama, Naruto said in a monotone. All I did was show up for class this morning and suddenly I am dragged before you. Did I perhaps do something wrong? You poisoned the entire class. For a taijutsu test. Naruto looked to his fuming teacher with his usual look of impassive confusion that you could only see if you've known the blonde for years. What proof do you have of that claim, Irika-sensei? Proof? Proof? Irika yelled, nearly hysterical from the amount of anger already built up from the blonde's denial. What other proof do I need? Everyone, and I mean every single student aside from you have magically come down with food poisoning, the flu, stomach viruses and various other conditions I'm sure not even Tsunade has fucking heard of. You've been picking herbs and ordering other shady materials from merchants for the past week, wandering suspiciously close to clan compounds and civilian households. And if that wasn't the vinegar on the damn cake, you were the only one who showed for the taijutsu test this morning, healthy as the day you were fucking born. If that's not suspicious as all hell, then I'm not a goddamn chunin. So what you're telling me is, you somehow have been keeping tabs on your 9-year-old student's daily life outside of school grounds, dragged multiple bystanders into your investigation without probable cause, and somehow have come to the conclusion that I am the perpetrator of a serious crime that you have no solid proof of me performing? If anything, I am the victim here, while you seriously need to see a Yamanaka for psychiatric therapy. Having random delusions and conspiracy theories on the field can only bear negative results to both your health and your teammates' safety in the future, or you're a pedophile, and if that's the case, then you should be immediately detained and put on trial. Pedophilia of any kind has a zero tolerance for shinobi of the leaf, and you could be looking to face anywhere from 30 years to life in incarceration. Iruka could only gawk at the nerve of this completely insane little shit. Not only does he deny the crimes he had obviously been weeded out committing, but now he's turned it on him. The nerve of this little. Don't turn this on me, damn it. Do you have any idea the uproar you've caused? We had to compensate civilian families for the week their kids were out of school. Not only that, but they demanded repercussion for your actions that we couldn't legally do since you're yet a registered shinobi. Hell, you're lucky the clan heads found your actions amusing. Otherwise you'd have every clan in Konoha on your fucking head. You're lucky I'm your teacher, or I would have thrown your ass at the first parent ready to take your ass. Iruka finished with heaving breaths as he looked down to the shinobi in training, who looked back nonplussed. Seeing he was out of tobacco, Hiruzen reached into his desk to grab the extra, stronger batch he always kept in his office just for situations like this. Guilty or no, he couldn't deny what Naruto had done was impressive. Hitting every clan and student without getting caught by a soul had to be one hell of a feat. He would praise the boy if the reasoning behind it wasn't so plain. Though this was a story he would surely tell when he returned to his clan halls. He was supposed to be the Hokage at this point in time, and it wouldn't look good if he was praising the boy for crimes. However, he wouldn't deny watching his chunin lose his wits was quite amusing to see. I see how that could be a detriment to my shinobi resume in the future, to be on the watch list as a potential threat to both my teammates, and sensei would be a problem for my future shinobi career. You are correct, sensei. And I finally see the seriousness and consequences that would befall me from this incident. Iruka seemed to sigh in relief, thankful his student was finally fessing up to his crimes like the adult he portrayed to be. If I did it. The guffawing in the blonde's head increased tenfold. Naruto, 10 years old, February 3rd. Inside the most infamous training ground in Konohagaku no Sato, also known as the Forest of Death, where monstrous animals and insects alike roam and poisonous plants you wouldn't find growing anywhere else in the elemental nations, sat a youth with spiky blonde hair and a foam green strand hanging in front of his face. He currently sat alone in one of the few clearings in the heavily forested area. Crisscross with closed eyes as if meditating, the boy currently wore a black sleeveless jacket with fishnet underneath, orange trousers with a pouch strapped over his leg by tape, and completed the look with black open-toed shinobi boots that went halfway up his shins and had the cuffs of the pants tucked in. If anyone were to come across this scene, they would be wondering just what the hell someone his age was doing a place where the death toll was over 100 every year in the village. This forest was heavily contained for a reason and was only meant for the chunin exams. It was not meant for shinobi in training, or wet behind the ears kids as most jonin would put it, to be roaming around without the supervision of a jonin or higher. However, Naruto Uzumaki was no normal trainee. He was here for a reason, and said reason was currently embedded into the ground before him. A double-edged, two-handed sword that had the pointed edge of a blade, but had the fuller design like a human spine with one side sharp, the other with vertebrae edges, and every 2 inches of the blade splitting like discs. The guard of the blade resembled that of a dragon's wings, while the rain guard was wide and had a hole in the center. You would think the blade's design by itself would mark it as unique, but you'd be wrong. This was no ordinary blade, and that fact was proven a second later when, of all things, a giant centipede came rushing out of the closest bushes and right at the unmoved blonde, just when the monstrous insect was about to close in on its prey. Azure eyes shot open and immediately grabbed the embedded sword before jumping over the incoming threat, while airborne. The sword seemed to come to life as it pulsed red before the spine-like sword seemed to break apart into multiple pieces. Many would be confused at the sudden destruction of the sword, but would be more shocked at the cord that connected each separated piece. The once 4-foot sword was now over 10 meters long and was currently being twirled wildly around. At a closer look, the blonde could be seen twirling the handle of the sword above his head almost lazily. The ease at which he twirled the weapon while making sure the sword stayed controlled showed both rigorous, non-stop training and dedication to his art. A second later, the now whipped blade was swung towards the insect that had missed its prey. With little effort, the tip of the blade broke through the armor of the giant insect and continued completely through the bug until it was feet deep in the dirt, landing on a branch. Naruto watched the insect he had impaled writhe in pain for a few seconds before recalling his weapon. More green blood was sprayed over the land as multiple jagged blade edges ripped more out of the insect than it did going in. Another second later, the sword was back in its base form and Naruto had to swipe the sword to get the insect's blood from his now most precious treasure. He didn't have time to watch the insect die since not even a second later, a barrage of kunai was thrown from his six, quickly following his sixth sense. He hopped off the branch before he could become a human porcupine. Now mid-air, he was once again forced to take action as an axe, or all things, came spinning out of nowhere. Quickly dodging the spinning projectile, he allowed his sword to extend till it was embedded into a nearby tree. He quickly let the sword reel him in and out of the previous dangerous position. However, he was not able to rest just yet since a rain of kunai, swords, axes, lances, and many other sharp tools he couldn't identify at a glance began to rain from above. With one hand sign, he had been replaced with a log and watched from a secure location as the log was peppered by sharp silver steel. Now hidden in a nearby bush, Naruto took the time to search for his attacker. From where he could see, there was no one around. He had a suspicion of where the attacker could be based off the direction the weapons had all been thrown, but was sure his opponent was smarter than to stay in place when their location can possibly be discovered from their weapon's trajectory. After a few minutes of watching and seeing nothing out of the ordinary, the blonde allowed himself to relax and close his eyes. To anyone watching, it would have just been a second since the blonde relaxed, but to the blonde he had gotten everything he needed to know in that small second without anyone being the wiser. His eyes were suddenly back open and he immediately threw multiple kunai with pinpoint accuracy to a bush 30 meters away at his 5. As if predicting the future, he dissembled his sword and whipped it out towards just above the foliage as a figure shot into the air. What the? He was rewarded by his whip sword wrapping around his intended target, getting a squeak of surprise as he reeled it in. The human figure landed hard in front of him, while whispering curses at its harsh landing. The figure, most definitely female, looked up to her captor with a sneer as he casually bent down to poke her in the head. Poke, Naruto said with as much emotion as a rock. I win. Tenten only grew angrier at the blonde's attempt at humor. You're cheating. I just know you're cheating, you blonde prick. Naruto stared down at her blankly as if that was one of the dumbest things she had ever said. The bun-haired girl grew flustered at the unspoken lecture and looked away with flushed cheeks. Cheating or no, asking Naruto to fight fair was like asking a brick to be soft. Can you at least tell me how you cheated this time? If you're going to keep kicking my ass, I at least have a right to know how you're doing it. Naruto looked up and thought for about half a minute before looking back down at his expectant friend. No. Ignoring the curses being spat from his prisoner, Naruto couldn't help but admire the hilt of the sword he had been using now for the past 6 months. No matter how many times he looked at it, it was still as beautiful as the day he woke up next to it. This very unique sword had been one of the yearly gifts given to him by none other than Ghost-san herself. Yes, she had told him it was the best and last gift she could give him, and he had accepted it wholeheartedly without question of how she even got it into reality. It was just one of the many mysterious he was happy not knowing about since, secrets or no, Ghost-san was his most precious person and he believed she would tell him when she was ready. It was because of Ghost-san that he would be graduating soon. It was because of Ghost-san that he was able to have more time than most to train his skills to his fullest. It was Ghost-san who was always there to fill his void of loneliness when no one else would. And it was because of Ghost-san that he still drew breath. He didn't know when, but one day he would pay back Ghost-san for everything she has done for him, and that was a promise of a lifetime. Databao. Untie me, damn it. Naruto 11 years old. September 10th. A couple years ago, Naruto would proudly declare that he hated reading. It was an activity that was not only extremely boring and lacked any physical exertion other than turning a page and moving his eyes, but he couldn't deny the benefits he reaped from reading a good book or scroll. Just by reading a few scrolls, he already knew more about history in the span of 3 months than he would have learned in the next year at the academy. Though he's learned much from that prison he'd call a school, the speed at which the teachers taught were just not to his liking. The fact that the school literally wouldn't teach the kids anything above a D-rank jutsu was off-putting in and of itself, so, what they couldn't, or wouldn't, teach him at the academy, he would learn at the library. Now, he didn't just up and decide he wanted to go to the library and learn more about the history of the shinobi world. No, this decision to read about history came straight from Ghost-san itself. For some reason, the distorted voice in his head told him it wanted to know more about the world of shinobi and basically demanded he read more about it, or he would stop supplying him his gift. Remembering just how useful the ability he was given for his birthday, plus how much Ghost-san had taught and saved him many times in the past, he speedily, yet reluctantly, went to the library every day to read up a scroll or two about the history of Konoha and the entire elemental nations. He would be lying if he said he got nothing out of the experience. Quite the contrary. Since he became an academy student, there was a section he could visit without the librarian getting on his case. It wasn't much at first glance, just a bunch of scrolls about chakra control and hand signs that he was not so good at. However, he came across gold in the form of a book written by none other than the Yondaime Hokage himself, Fuinjutsu for Beginners. Naruto was hooked the moment he saw who the book was written by. Namikaze Minato, the fourth, and greatest, in his mind, Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, the man that almost single-handedly ended the Third Great Shinobi War with the use of his Hiraishin Jutsu. The man also known as a Fuinjutsu master as well as one of the best shinobi to ever live. Naruto had a dream to become the greatest shinobi that ever lived. It was a dream he decided to pursue the day he ate ramen with the current Hokage of Konoha. A dream that he would achieve by any means necessary. So, in his mind, whatever the Yondaime had his hands in had to be something worth investigating. Unfortunately, he underestimated just how hard the art of Fuinjutsu would be. On paper, Fuinjutsu was just an art where you wrote a bunch of characters on a piece of paper, and the paper would come to life to whatever was written. In reality, it was a complete complex system of kanji and mathematic equations that one had to be spot on with, or you would either get no result, or, in worst case scenario, get an unwanted, and sometimes devastating, backlash. He learned this the hard way when he attempted to make a paper bomb at home. After reading the book for 3 months, he figured he was finally ready to move on to more advanced material than putting blocks together with chakra paper and solving stupid puzzles. So he decided to move straight to the final intermediate challenge of the book instead of going through the rest of the challenges one by one like he had been doing. One slight character out of place and the use of the wrong kanji completely turned his apartment floor into nothing but rubble. Thankfully, Ghost-san, like always, reversed the fabric of time and brought him back from the spirit world. However, he was forever scarred mentally and did not attempt Fuinjutsu again until 3 months later. Once he finally completed the book, he completely understood why the fourth called Fuinjutsu the hardest art to master. He believed his head would explode any minute from the amount of mathematical equations and history he had to store into his tiny brain. But nonetheless, the positive outcomes of learning Fuinjutsu far exceeded the minuscule amount of cons. For one, his grades in class had improved drastically from his first year. He went from being in the top 20 to sitting comfortably in the top 10, much to everyone at the academy's shock. Skipping a year was just the icing on the cake. If that wasn't good enough, then the fact that Hokage Jiji himself said that he would give him the second part of the Hokage's book once he was evaluated by the current and only seal master of Konoha, Jiraiya of the Sannin, make the blonde feeling excited at the future possibilities. Just thinking about the proud face of the Hokage made the Uzumaki want to work even harder towards his ultimate goal, and he was sure the old man would be there to help him every step of the way. But at this current moment in time, Naruto couldn't help but glare at the aging Hokage before him as he asked the one question that has been on his mind for the past week. Jiji, am I a Jinchuriki? Hiruzen nearly swallowed his pipe from the gasp that left his lips. After a few seconds of choking and regathering his composure, he looked into the eyes of the frowning boy he would be proud to call someone important in his life. He knew Naruto Uzumaki was a bright boy for his age and knew it was only a matter of time before he came across the truth considering his found interest in the art of Fuinjutsu. Not only that, but the fact he completed the Fuinjutsu book that not even High Jonin could complete within a year told Hiruzen a lot about the boy's talents. He could still remember the retired shinobi librarian's fearful report 4 years ago, when she came across the Jinchuriki delving heavily into the art of sealing. Thankfully, after talking to the boy, and having Anbu observe him closer every day for the next 6 months, he didn't seem to know anything about the Kyubi nor had any interest in Jinchuriki at all. But, like everything, eventually problems you hold off comes back to bite you right in the ass. Hiruzen only wished the boy was older before he heard the truth from his mouth. With a hand sign, he dismissed his ANBU and activated the privacy seals in his office. Hiruzen put on the mask of the Hokage he was supposed to be and stared intensely at his favorite unrelated grandson. He couldn't be any more enthusiastic about the conversation he was about to have even if a kunai was to his throat. But from the look in the youth's eyes there was no way out of it. Better now than never. Before I answer any of that, Naruto-kun, may I first ask why questions of Jinchuriki have crossed your mind and how you've come to the conclusion that you are currently a vessel? Naruto's frown stayed put for a second before he spoke back to the man he currently had mixed feeling about. I was in the middle of completing one of my Fuinjutsu assignments. The current topic was sealing specific items into scrolls or paper tags. It was as I was completing the assignment that a question began running through my head. If you could seal objects into other objects, then would it be possible to seal things into other beings? Here, the young Uzumaki's frown seemed to deepen. It was only by coincidence that this month also happened to be the same month I celebrate my birth that I remembered the seal that appears on my stomach whenever I use chakra. Before I delved into Fuinjutsu, I had no idea what the characters on my stomach represented or why it was there. However, the more I advanced, the more some of the complicated formulas began to make sense. Before I knew it, I was able to piece together the symbols that were similar to that of a sealing scroll. I tried researching characters to uncover whatever it was locked away, but to no success. So, in other words, there was something sealed inside me that I never remembered putting there. Hiruzen would have defended the actions taken by the fourth, but couldn't since it didn't seem the blonde was finished. That same day I remembered someone in my childhood throwing the word Jinchuriki at me, a word that literally translates to power of human sacrifice. Everything began piecing together after that. The Kyubi attack 9 years ago, my birth date, Jinchuriki, the hate from the people. Naruto was now openly snarling at the man he called Jiji. Please tell me, Hokage-sama, what else have you been keeping from me? The Hokage let out a breath before looking down to his unrelated grandson, preparing to give news he wasn't too keen on revealing. Listen, Naruto-kun, what I'm about to tell you is an S-rank secret, and it can never leave this room. Do I make myself perfectly clear? He received an answer with a short nod before closing his eyes, knowing this was inevitable. And so, he told him everything, beginning to end, from the day the Kyubi attacked, to the eventual sealing of the beast, from the fourth's words of how he wanted Naruto to be held as a hero, to the eventual law that was passed to protect the boy from the village he called home. Nothing was left out, and Naruto stayed silent throughout. Once he was finished, the Hokage sat with bated breath on the blonde's response. He had told him everything he knew and the blonde barely blinked throughout the 15-minute-long explanation. That's why it was so baffling to the Hokage when he did finally speak. And what of the fourth? My father? The flabbergasted look the Hokage showed told the young Uzumaki more than he would have liked. And Kushina Uzumaki? At this point, the Hokage had his head down in shame. The blonde could only shake his head, disappointed in the one man he was sure he could trust with his life. I see. You still keep secrets from me even now, he spoke in a low, detached voice before standing from his chair and walking towards the door. The Hokage could only stare speechless at the boy he'd called family walk away from him in disappointment. Before Naruto left, he turned to his grandfather figure with utter disappointment plain to see on his face. I do not wish to see you for a while, Hokage-sama. Neither knew. It would be far too long and far too late before the young blonde ever forgave the current god of shinobi. Naruto 12 years old, October 10th, Mindscape. Naruto looked around as he wandered aimlessly through the empty void. For the past month, he had been having this same dream without ever making any progress on why it was happening. He had tried confiding in Ghost-san, but he hadn't heard her voice in the past month either, not on the day he normally celebrated, and not even today. His actual birthday, as usual. He couldn't help the paranoia he felt without her constant protection, but he soldiered through. Now he knew there was a reason behind her silence, and he was sure it had something to do with the void he currently found himself exploring. It would seem his wandering bore fruit, since not even 100 feet into his usual walk, a 20-foot-tall wooden door blurred into view before him. The oak wood looked worn. Multiple vines poked through the cracks on the surface, and the metal twirling dragon emblem in the center was rusted and cracked along the beast's neck. He would have examined it more, but his curiosity of what laid inside overrode his appreciation for the architecture of the door. Not wasting any time, he pushed forward on the door and was surprised at just how light the 20-foot structure was. The door let out an ominous creak before it was fully open, taking Cat-Ian. He walked in and looked in all corners. The wooden door led to an open cobblestone corridor that stretched far. It was as he was observing the room that his eyes finally stopped on the steps of stone that lead further to the ceiling. His eyes slowly traveled up each step until his eyes landed on the throne at the top. He couldn't stop his eyes from widening marginally at the figure he saw sitting on the throne. The figure, definitely a girl, was sitting on the throne with one leg up on the throne while the other dangled over the edge. One hand sat lazily across her lap while the other sat on the armrest and held up the petite face that was smirking down at the blonde. She had long, spiky parakeet green hair that went down to her ankles. Red and white ribbons tied together the front of her hair into 2 braids, and a golden heart-shaped tiara kept the rest of the hair behind her. She had matching colored seafoam eyes that shined with amusement, and long pointed ears much like an elf that seemed to be twitching every now and then. Her attire consisted of a dark blue dress that showed her midriff and above her non-existent breast freely, covering only the important part of her female anatomy. The dress was a double slit that stopped just below her hips while the back overflowed to the ground. The last notable thing about the girl's attire was a necklace made of rope connecting into diamond patterns from her arms, neck, and finally, a totem pole-like object hanging from the rope going down to her high thigh. Naruto had never met this girl. He had never seen anyone that remotely resembled this girl. However, that did not mean he didn't know exactly who this girl was. It was a feeling. But that feeling rushed through the rest of his body, and for the first time in his life, his heart skipped a beat. Seems we finally meet face to face, Uzumaki Naruto. And he already knew her name, a name that had been whispered into his ear for the past month, a name he had wished to know for over 9 years. It's good to finally see you too, Sothis. Congratulations on passing, Uzumaki Naruto. You are free to take any headband you wish. Iruka said proudly to the blonde that simply nodded in thanks and picked up the nearest headband that would mark him as a Konoha shinobi. He examined the black headband that had a metal plate and the symbol of a leaf in the middle before tying it to his forehead and looking to one of the men that was a big factor in his life. Iruka looked back at him with a smile that was almost blinding. It was hard to believe this man and Shitori-sensei dealt with him for over 5 years. For that, he would show his gratefulness by becoming the shinobi he swore to become. He bowed at the waist to the 2 teachers in front of him, one smiling happily, while the other was trying hard to keep her tears from showing. I want to thank both of you for everything you've done for me. The things you've taught me will never be forgotten. Wiping her eyes, the brunette teacher next to Iruka shouted chokily, "Gee, get out of here already, you stupid brat." Letting out a chuckle while shaking his head, Iruka looked to his blonde student as proudly as he could portray himself. I know you will do great things for this village, Naruto. Congratulations once again. And make sure to be here next week for team placements at 8 o'clock sharp, got it? Naruto gave the Chunin one of his rare smiles before bowing one more time and exiting the room. Back in the hall with the few who stuck around after they either passed and failed, absolutely no one was surprised when the last examinee walked out with a headband wrapped around his forehead. Not wasting any time, Naruto did a shunsh into the back of the school. This would stop any one of the parents or students from seeing him and completely dodging. Thought you could get away, did ya? His very bothersome friend, said friend who currently had him in a headlock and was furiously rubbing her knuckles into his head. Oh, I knew you'd pass, buddy. Wasn't ever a doubt in my mind. Can you please release me, Tenten-san? Naruto asked politely, not commenting on his friend's boyish behavior. Tenten only pouted and obliged, crossing her arms and puffing her cheeks much like a 5-year-old would do. Why don't you react to anything I do anymore? I even put you closer to my bust, and nothing. Am I not woman enough for you, or are you just gay? Tenten shouted nearly hysterically at the blonde while comically waving her fist in the air. The blonde just looked at her, looked at her chest, then back at her without showing a hint of remorse or embarrassment. You must first have something to present on the female anatomy in order to finish that sentence, and I will castrate you, staple your balls to the Hokage Tower's front door, and get his stamp of approval over them, Uzumaki. More from curiosity on how she would actually pull that off than fear, the blonde closed his mouth. Wow, and I thought my followers were cruel, the voice in the blonde's head interjected, getting a nod from the Uzumaki that the bun-haired girl took as her own with a satisfied nod. Great! So we're celebrating at our success at the usual, right? Naruto, regretfully, shook his head. Unfortunately, I have prior engagements today, Tenten-san, maybe another day of the week. The bun-haired girl looked at the blonde suspiciously. You'd better not be blowing me off to look at seals behind my back again. You promised you'd help me advance to. I assure you, it's nothing of the sort, Naruto interrupted. I've been summoned by the Hokage himself. An ANBU informed me that I am to be at his office, pass or fail, before the clock turns 3. Wait, the Hokage? Seriously? What did he want? Come on. Don't leave me hanging here. The kunoichi pushed, to which the blonde could only shrug. Didn't say, I can only speculate until I arrive, the blonde admitted. I'd love to continue our conversation, Tenten-san, but I do not want to keep the Hokage waiting. Celebrations will be in order at Ichiraku's within the hour. Food on me. Without another word, the blonde made a hand sign and disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Tenten blinked before shaking her head with a smile and walking out of the empty clearing. I guess I'll go tell Toussaint first. Hokage Tower? Ah, Naruto. Glad you're here on time, Hokage-sama. It said much about Hiruzen's composure that the smile didn't fall from his face at the blonde's formal use of his title. It has been 6 months since that day and Naruto has remained strictly professional with him. In the last 6 months alone, the boy has only been before him 3 times and all 3 times consisted of him being at the right place at the right time. To his credit, Naruto never really avoided him. Their schedules just didn't complement each other's and Naruto never sought him out like he used to do. Hiruzen was fine with that. He had wronged the boy more than anyone would ever know, and he would accept his punishment like the man he is. Don't force it, but accept it. Until the day Naruto comes to talk to him willingly, he will accept the boy's hate and disappointment wholeheartedly. Still, he wouldn't deny the happiness he was feeling at the moment to finally see the blonde once again after months if anyone had asked him. Is there something you needed, Hokage-sama? The Hokage's smile only widened despite the look of indifference the blonde was giving him at the moment. As a matter of fact, I do, Naruto-kun. I have something that I was informed to give you the day you graduated. The old man reached into his desk and pulled out a scroll before placing it on his desk. Naruto raised an eyebrow before walking to the desk. Seeing that it was a sealed scroll, he picked it up and pushed a bit of chakra into it, making something thick pop into existence to replace the scroll he'd just been holding. His eyes widened slightly at what he was now seeing. This is the 3rd level of Fuinjutsu, my boy. Jiraiya delivered it as a present for when you graduated. Since you've passed, I've no more reason to keep it collecting dust in my desk. Hiruzen continued to smile as he saw the emotion swimming through the blonde's eyes. One wouldn't be able to tell from just looking at the stoic blonde's usual plastic stare, but the look in his eyes always gave it away, and the Hokage gave himself a mental point for being able to figure it out throughout the years. The emotion, however, was not long-lived and the boy was now looking back to him with suspicion. Question, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen raised a brow at the sudden change of atmosphere. What is it, my boy? Is there any particular reason Jiraiya of the Sannin does not want to give this to me personally? The blonde asked, staring deep into the eyes of his Hokage to catch anything and everything the old man would think before he actually spoke. I've seen him many times along the years, and every time I tried to approach him, he always tried his damnedest to not speak to me or even outright avoided the place I frequent. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Hiruzen stared blankly at his, now, shinobi. In his mind, there were 2 ways he could reply. He could tell him the truth, which was the right thing to do and had every right to do so considering the Toad Sannins had basically abandoned the one he was supposed to be looking after all these years. However, not only would that cause bad blood between him and his former student, but he would be a complete hypocrite considering the things he'd kept, and is still keeping, away from his unrelated grandchild. The second would be to lie about any and every involvement, and potentially forever losing the trust of the Uzumaki Naruto and, As much as he hated to think this title, the Jinchuriki of his village, Jiraiya has his reasons, my boy, and I am fully aware of what those reasons are. However, that is not my story to tell. It is up to Jiraiya to come clean when he feels he is ready, and would only fruit negative results if you heard the truth from a third party. Don't you think? He would go with the third option, confirming, but slightly denying. This way, Jiraiya is slightly thrown under the wagon for his cowardice, but would not blow up as much as if he said nothing for the future. From the evaluating look the blonde was giving him, he could only hope his gamble wasn't for naught. Thankfully, the blonde seemed to shrug it off while bowing slightly before him. I appreciated your honesty. And the gift, Hokage-sama. I will make sure it is put to good use. I'm happy to hear that, Naruto-kun. I'd wished to speak more, but unfortunately, he gave a glance to the piling paperwork before letting out a long, suffering sigh. Duty has me in a bind, you are dismissed. The blonde saluted his leader by placing an arm over his chest and bowing at the waist. He was about to shun away but was stopped by the Hokage once more. Oh, and Naruto-kun. The Uzumaki stopped himself before he could disappear from the room. Hiruzen was looking back to him with that grandfatherly smile he used to give him before their relationship fell. Congratulations on graduating. If it's worth anything to you, I am proud to finally have you as a shinobi Konohagakure no Sato. Naruto said nothing. In fact, he honestly didn't know what to say at the moment. Despite it being a year, he still held resentment for the Hokage for keeping something from him that was vital to his life and by all rights his birthright. However, he wasn't stupid and knew the old man had his reasons to keep that information from him. Even if he knew what said reasons were and didn't at all agree to them, nevertheless, the old man was trying to gain his friendship back despite his reluctance. He was trying, while here he was, acting like the kid he hated to be called. Thank you, Hokage-Gigi. Without another word, the blonde bowed once more before vanishing in a blur of leaves. The smile slowly fell from the Hokage's face once the blonde was gone. Don't get him wrong. He was happy that the blonde was at least willing to take baby steps to renew their relationship, and he would do his damnedest to put everything he had into it. However, that was in the future. Right now, he had other problem concerning the blonde that has been on his mind for half a year now. Bird. A figure suddenly melted out of the shadow on the roof and landed on one knee before his liege with his head down. It was a figure dressed in the standard leaf ANBU and had a blank face mask over his face that was in the shape of a bird's beak. The long brown hair that was tied into a ponytail midway to his back told most shinobi of the leaf that this man identified as one amongst the Hyuga clan. The bird-masked individual said nothing as he waited for his Hokage to speak. What did you see when he used his chakra? Understanding he was given permission to talk, the ANBU stayed in his kneeling position and spoke in a deep baritone. Sir, my findings were troubling, to say the least. The Hokage raised an eye at his subordinate's words. How so? The ANBU seemed hesitant to speak, but did so anyways despite his turmoil. Young Uzumaki Naruto has an above-average chakra pool for an Uzumaki. Hiruzen blinked as he looked at his ANBU. I failed to see what's so troubling about that, bird. For an Uzumaki, young Naruto is expected to have a large chakra pool due to their heritage. Not only that, but his tenant should make it far more than the average shinobi. I thought that would be obvious, would it not? The ANBU stayed silent once more before speaking up again. I think you misinterpret my words, sir. Yes, I said his chakra pool is bigger than the average Uzumaki. The ANBU seemed to pause before he continued. However, that's it. Nothing abnormal. Nothing special. Just above average. If I could use an example, then I would compare his chakra pool to that of Kushina Uzumaki, the former demon container. When I saw hers, it was always a dark purple. Her chakra mixed with the Kyuubi's had skyrocketed her already large chakra system. If she was a battery, she could easily have given chakra to supply over 200 shinobi, and still have some left over to fight a Sannin. However, Uzumaki doesn't have half of that. Hiruzen's jaw began to slowly drop at the ANBU's words. In fact, there was nothing special about his chakra that I could see. No taint, no other abnormalities. Just normal, for lack of a better word. The only thing abnormal about Naruto Uzumaki is that, as you know, his heart still does not beat, yet his body still operates like a normal human being. Hiruzen began getting to the edge of his seat as fear began to dominate his thoughts. Kami, you don't mean to tell me the Kyuubi is... Much to the relief of the Hokage, the ANBU shook his head. No, the seal is still in place, and there is definitely something being held behind it, however. I have no idea if what's behind it is the QB or something else. Without going into his head personally and checking the seal, no one will ever know what's behind that seal until it is broken or the boy somehow opens it himself. Both outcomes being highly improbable considering the man who put it there. Either the yondaime did his job a little too well, or something went very wrong with the sealing and the QB is not where we thought it had been all these years. And the sword? Still at large, sir. The Hokage could only let out a frustrated grunt as he relaxed in his chair and pulled out his pipe. On the bright side, everything concerning his graduation test made a lot more sense now. He knew there would be no way for the boy to pass the class if he could not perform the Bunshin clone technique, a simple technique on paper, but becomes extremely difficult and downright impossible for those who hold too much chakra. But it would seem this was a minor setback in his plans. He had meant for the boy to get frustrated and ask him for alternate tests that could prove his abilities much like they were forced to do with the Rock Lee kid. He would then give the boy a jutsu that would not only help him in the future, but hopefully have him pass the test with flying colors. However, the boy passed, and now him passing brought up this very predicament that had him shook. All his options were too high risk and the only real solution was not in the village. Asking the boy would just lead to him telling him the same thing he'd said for the past 6 years. I've never spoken to any fox, Gigi. He'd like to believe that. But considering the multiple reports of people catching the boy talking to himself since he was 5 and the sword that basically grew itself overnight told him the boy's word couldn't be trusted, no matter how much he treasures him. Other options were just as bad. There's no way he could or would send a Yamanaka into the mind of a Jinchuriki. That was just asking for the beast to fry the Mindwalker's brain, and he'd had lost a valuable asset over a suspicion. Valid, but a suspicion nonetheless. The Byakugan, apparently, couldn't see beyond the Yondaime's seal, and the only other that possibly could see through it or get the answers he needed was Sharingan. But there were only 2 and one hadn't developed it yet while the other is a traitor. His hands were tied in this case, and all he could do was wait until Jiraiya came back to take a look at the seal once again. He let out a long puff of smoke as he realized this would be yet another secret he'd be keeping from the boy he was trying to mend relations with. Knock knock. The ANBU suddenly disappeared back into the ceiling at the knock on the Hokage's door. Hokage-sama, Danzo Shimura is here to speak with you. Hiruzen let out another puff in place of a sigh as another headache was about to enter his office. Let him in. His secretary opened the door, and right behind her walked a heavily bandaged man who wore a black cloak over his white yukata that hid his completely bandaged right arm. The right side of his face was also bandaged, covering his right eye, while wrinkles showed his gaze and a scar in the shape of an X covered his chin. He walked in past the secretary with his only free arm holding a wooden cane that clattered every time it hit the floor. He stopped before the Hokage's desk and stared down intensely at the old man who stared back at him with equal intensity. A pregnant silence covered the room before Danzo was the one to finally break the ice, as the young ones would say. From the look in your eyes, I'm going to assume my suspicions were correct? Hiruzen sighed for the umpteenth time that day, causing the old war hawk to shake his head and sit down in the chair in front of the Hokage's desk. Your findings? To be honest, I haven't a clue. The warhawk raised his only visible brow, expecting Hiruzen to elaborate. Something is definitely there. However, it's not performing the way a seal for a Jinchuriki should. Explain. And Hiruzen did. He told his old friend everything Bird had saw and the conclusions they'd have to draw until Jiraiya was back in the village. Danzo sat there unmoving and listened to the whole thing. Whether or not he was worried or confused, the warhawk showed none of it. I see, Danzo muttered. And when was the last time you've heard from Jiraiya? A couple weeks back, Hiruzen admitted. I sent a letter regarding Naruto's graduation and the situation. But he currently found a lead on Orochimaru, and has only sent his regards in the form of the next stage of the boy's Fuinjutsu training. The look on Danzo's face told the Hokage he didn't believe that for a minute. How he could read a man who was basically squinting and had no discernible features other than a look of indifference was beyond mortal minds. He is a coward, Danzo stated simply, and Hiruzen could not disagree in the slightest. Regardless, there is no way you can leave things as they are. Though I may not have agreed on all of Namake's decisions, understatement of the century, Hiruzen thought to himself. I cannot see him as someone who would foolishly throw away power he and his wife no doubt had the tools and skills to contain it with. Minato was many things in my eyes, a fool being one of them. but lacking in intelligence he did not. For once, I agree with you, old friend, Hiruzen reluctantly concurred. This would be a lot easier if Minato clued me in on the project he was working on, but alas, he did not, and it has put us in the situation we are in now. There was a period of silence between the two before Hiruzen spoke almost accusingly. And I'm guessing you already have a solution for this problem? Why else would you come to me just when we were discussing this particular topic? Not even giving a hint that he'd been caught red-handed, the Warhawk nodded and got a puff of smoke, thankfully not in his direction. In response, I'm willing to listen as always, but know that I will not be taking any inhumane approaches to this matter, Danzo. Much to his surprise and shock, the Warhawk chuckled. There is no need for me to take such actions, Hiruzen, he admitted, though my views on shinobi has not changed. Uzumaki has opened my eyes over the years to exceptions. Anything of my teachings would be detrimental to an already promising talent, even if his current loyalties are in question. Hiruzen didn't have a word to say to that. He knew Danzo, and he knew the man wasn't one for praises, especially the one he thought to be nothing more than a weapon for years. What exactly the blonde did to get on his good side, he most likely would never know. Go on. Danzo nodded and proceeded as told. The boy has recently graduated, has he not? The Hokage nodded, beginning to guess where this could be going. This may not be nor my agent's specialty, but I propose we place a special member into his team placement. Not seeing Hiruzen outright reject his proposal like usual, the Warhawk continued, be it mine or your own, we place an agent into his team, preferably one close to his own age, and have them report any sudden changes, use of chakra, and talking to himself they find. Hiruzen blinked slowly at his former teammate, waiting for the catch. To his surprise, after about a minute, the Warhawk had none. That's pretty tamed, compared to suggestions you'd put forward in the past. Danzo, of all people the Hokage would have expected this from, snorted. Fucking snorted. Unfortunately, my best agent, as you know, is still currently keeping tabs on the Uchiha. I cannot pull him from that mission for obvious reasons we've already discussed in the past. There was a pause in his explanation before the Warhawk began to look his age and let out a sigh that wouldn't look too off on a disappointed father. However, I do have another that would, as you'd say, fit the bill. Uzumaki residence. A few hours later, Naruto opened the door of his apartment carrying multiple bags that contained various substances, not needing to close the door as he walked in. All in thanks to a seal he'd earlier created to close it after he'd walked in. He placed the bags near his room door and turned the light on in the area that was a fuse of his kitchen and living room. He let out a nod of satisfaction as he saw his living quarters was the same as he left it. Piles and piles of books sat in the far corner of the room, while some were left scattered along the ground and the table that sat in the middle of the room. Multiple either incomplete seals laid around the area in plastic bags so no other ink or substances could ruin or make it go off prematurely. Every piece of furniture, which was just a futon and couch, had a seal in the middle to keep it from being destroyed by blunt force and other random elements, while the kitchen area remained the only part of the apartment that seemed relatively clean. It was small, and a bit of a mess, but this place was his home. I know I've seen your home many times through your eyes, but this place truly is revolting. Completely out of character, Naruto jumped in fright at the sudden voice. Now, you would think the blonde would had already gotten used to a voice suddenly speaking out of nowhere. Considering the being that lived in his head, you'd be correct. It had been years since the voice in his head had frightened him. In those years, he'd grown somewhat of an immunity of being suddenly frightened, a lesson Tenten had learned quite quickly. However, what made this instance so different was the voice it belonged to and where exactly it was coming from, particularly, right behind him. Swiftly turning around, he was met with Sothis floating in midair, arms and legs crossed and furrowed brows showing disapproval as she combed the blonde's living quarters. Honestly, how can a child with a mind so bright stand living in a place so horrendously disorganized? In fact, how do you even find anything in this mess? There's just towers and towers of junk and rabble. This is completely unacceptable, child. Seeing that she was getting no reaction from her host, she turned and was gifted with the look of complete bewilderment on her vessel's face. Sothis simply raised an eyebrow at her host. What? I am a goddess, you know? With most of my power restored, projecting a spiritual form is but child's play to me now. The goddess in spiritual form face suddenly became amused as she positioned herself in midair with an arm propping up her head and her body relaxed laterally as if laying on a couch, though I have to say, your current expression is quite amusing to see with my own eyes. Slowly closing his mouth, the blonde stared at the spirit for a few more seconds before he turned and sat at the table that held his fuinjutsu notes. We humans call it organized chaos. The blonde replied in his usual tone as he picked up the brush on the table and began writing characters on the unfinished seal before him. Sothis sighed as she shook her head. Your lack of emotions truly irks me at times, child. Aren't your emotions a key element to your humanity? If you continue suppressing them, what will you do when the time comes for you to express those emotions to others? Especially in the career you currently pursue? The blonde looked to his partner, and with a complete straight face replied, if you are talking about those types of missions, then I believe my overwhelmingly sexy looks alone is more than adequate in attracting the opposite sex. There was a long silence in the room as both spirit and human stared blankly at each other, one looking expectantly for some reason, while the other tried to process what had just been said. Japes do not suit you, child. If the goddess didn't know any better, she'd say. The slight frown and rise of his lower lip was a pout. She didn't get to observe it more since he turned back to the work on his futon. Dropping that subject, the spirit began floating round the room as she brought up a completely different matter. So, what are your plans regarding that old man? Nothing at the moment, the blonde replied honestly. All I know for now is that he suspects me of something. What that is exactly, I can only speculate. Humph. And here I was going to convince you to start forgiving the old man, though I understand what a man of his station must do to protect his followers. There has to be a fine line in regard to. This sudden thought of wariness around the Hokage stemmed from a seal he'd created to spot chakra signatures, suddenly go off the moment he stepped into the Hokage's office. The seal, which was hidden just above the obvious one on his stomach, would only pulse when there is someone or something using chakra anywhere within a 5-meter diameter of himself. Since it fused into his skin, it was easy to hide from chakra sensors, especially Byakugan and Sharingan users. You never know. The fact that it went off before he entered the room and stayed active until he left the room told his that he was being observed, since there was no chakra suddenly thrown at him, and he was sure the Hokage didn't activate his privacy seals like the last time they'd spoken. The blonde easily narrowed it down to the only clan that could have an observation jutsu, the Hyuga. Maybe they wanted to check the seal. Maybe they know something about Sothis replacing the fox. Or maybe they've grown suspicious on whether or not he is, still indeed, Naruto Uzumaki. It was all just speculations at the moment, and Naruto hated speculations. The mens had been quite suspicious of late. I know I'm missing something, but I just can't put my finger on what it is. Naruto agreed absent-mindedly. Maybe more direct methods should be made. I am willing to supply you with a divine pulse, but only if you... Just when Naruto had thought he could trust the old man again, he goes and raises his suspicion to the max once more. Are Jinchuriki really that unstable? Are there emotions to the point that constant surveillance was a must? Despite his research about his special situation, there's just not a lot roaming around about Jinchuriki, and the ones who do know something always became tight-lipped about the subject. There was just nothing the blonde could do about it at the moment, and that only made him more and more frustrated as the thought crossed his mind. This would just have to be something he'd let go until he had more information. Maybe it was finally time for him to acquire outside help. He'd had this same thought in the past, but there just wasn't, and still isn't, anyone he could trust with the information and power he'd had for over 9 years now. No, if he was going to get the information he needed, then it would have to be outside the village. Maybe the sand? No, that wouldn't work. Though there was definitely a Jinchuriki in the sand, he didn't know exactly where it was in the desert. Plus, it would take 2 days' travel for him to get there, and there was no way Sothis's power would last before he could find anything useful. He'd already been through nearly every book in the... He'd apparently been thinking too long since the goddess in his room quickly grew annoyed at being ignored for the minute she'd been giving her input. She rectified the situation by doing the only thing she thought would get his attention back. She flew behind him and went right through his stomach till she was now looking up at him while blocking the view of his work. Hey you dolt! Listen when... The sudden appearance of the spirit through his abdomen made the blonde accidentally miswrite his desired character on the seal he was working on. In typical Fuinjutsu failure fashion, the seal glowed bright white before it exploded and sent the blonde blasting back into his bedroom wall. Unlike his more difficult seals, this was a simple storage seal and did not carry as much characters as the others, therefore, the explosion it emitted was relatively tamed compared to its predecessors. That did not, however, mean the blonde and his apartment went unscathed. The table, floor, and couch remained unmarked due to the seals he placed to specifically counter this exact situation. But the multiple unfinished tags and the books he'd had piled up were now all scattered around the room. Meanwhile, he'd been planted firmly into the wall to the point he stuck there like a nailed picture frame. Sothis calmly floated over to the implanted blonde, wasn't even blink from the debris and rubble covering his workstation. Huh, that was more amusing to watch than through your own eyes. I'll have to make spending time outside your body a regular occurrence if events such as this can so easily entertain me. The blonde replied in the form of slowly peeling off the wall until he landed face first onto the ground. 1 week later, Tenten was, for a lack of a better word, pissed. Now you'd think she'd be happy considering today was the day she'd finally start her career as a shinobi. You'd think she would be happy about being on the field and finally following in the footstep of the woman she'd admired all her life, Tsunade Senju. You would be absolutely right, she was, indeed, happy to finally be able to go on the field and better herself as a kunoichi. She'd be placed on a team and had high chances of getting a good jonin sensei from what her father had told her the lineup was. However, the team placement was exactly what had her unconsciously leaking killer intent, and her blonde friend, a word that was extremely strained at the moment, was at the center of the problem. Being the kunoichi of the year, there was no doubt who she'd be placed with. It had been a tradition for the past 40 years to put the top 2 best female and male students in the class together with the worst in order to make or break the worst. At a glance, the idea would seem idiotic to the average person that did not look beyond. However, no one could deny its effectiveness considering the 3 Sannin, Kakashi Hatake, Itachi Uchiha, the Sandame and Yandame all exceeded in their careers along with their teammates, even if not all followed a righteous path as a shinobi or survived to tell the tale. Saying that, her teammates were already narrowed down. One would be Asahi Shido, a kid who was average in every way possible while having the drive of a goldfish in a plastic bag and an attitude to match, and Naruto Uzumaki, the second genius in her class, even if he didn't exactly hold his emotions on his sleeve. Or anywhere for that matter. Now, that's exactly what would have happened if not for the bomb dropped on her head the moment she saw the board of names displaying her student year's grades. It was not Naruto Uzumaki at the top, in fact. The blonde was nowhere near the top. He barely made top 15. But that didn't mean a damn thing when there was only 18 out of 37 who actually passed. He was so far from the top that there wasn't a chance in hell he'd be put in the same team as her. Now she had to deal with the Hyuga prick and the Asahi for the remainder of her genin career, all because her best friend and rival basically sabotaged himself. Damn it all, you seem to be upset. Currently having her head rested on her palm and a not-so-happy look on her face, she turned slowly to the boy that was one wrong comment away from being punted across the room. His usual unexpressive face made her want to yank that strand of green hair in front of his eyes out of his head. Not saying a word because she knew her temper would probably boil over, she turned back to the front of the class to wait on their teacher to arrive. Did I, perhaps, offend you in some manner, Tenten-san? You think? She wanted to reply, but wisely kept to herself since she knew, once again, she was almost over the edge. Perhaps you are disappointed in my final scores? Her eye twitched. If that is the case, then I share your sentiment. For even the Hokage to deny my sound argument over the Academy kata is nothing short of shallow-mindedness. You're the shallow-minded idiot, you idiot. Tenten just had to snap at her friend, once again, very strained at the moment, at that last comment. UUGH. You had one job. One. Now I'm stuck on the team with Stuck Up and Ordini. Said Stuck Up frowned in his front seat, while Ordinary perked up as he could feel someone talking about him. To be fair, the outcome of your team does not dictate the future of your career, Naruto tried pointing out, but Tenten was having none of it. Of course it does. Who I end up with affects more than me. If you're teamed up with people who won't work hard and have an overall bad team synergy and atmosphere, then it affects your performance not only on the field, but the exams my dad told me we're supposed to take after team placements. That's not even to mention the Chunin exams. If you have even one weak link not willing to work with you on your team, then you are screwed. Screwed! The bun-haired girl ended her tirade by slamming her head against her table. enough to make her point, but not enough to physically harm herself. My career hasn't started and I can already see it ending. Naruto sorta, kinda, understood what his friend was saying. He might not feel the same, but he understood nonetheless. She was upset that due to him not meeting the academic standard for Shinobi of the Year, she would receive a less favorable team as a consequence. He still had trouble with social norms and things of the like, but he could tell that due to his actions, however unintentional, has caused her a smoother path through her career. In his mind, if anything were to happen to her in her career, she would no doubt blame him and their future friendship would be held by a thread. Seeing this obvious outcome, Naruto decided to use some of what Tenten-san had been teaching him about social conduct to lift her spirits. No, it was his job as a friend to lift her spirits. Naruto may still lack the common sense and many social cues he should know at this point in his life, but something was screaming that this was an opportunity he most definitely should not pass up. He had a line just for situations like this that was sure to lift the mood and some of the tension out of the air. If I gave you a kiss, would that make you feel better, Tenten-san? Tenten actually stopped her inner turmoil to robotically turn her head to her blonde-headed friend with strained eyes and perished lips so straight they were a line on her face. Meanwhile, the blonde stared back with, oddly enough, expectation practically glowing in his azure eyes. Definitely more for the reaction than the action that was implied. You really shouldn't tell jokes ever. If the kunoichi didn't know any better, she'd say the slight frown and rise of the blonde's lower lip was a pout. I have, unfortunately, been told something similar recently. Tenten thankfully didn't need to ask the blonde to elaborate since the teacher was now back in the room. After 10 minutes of Shitori-sensei telling them how proud she was of them all while sobbing halfway through her speech, she finally got to the team placements where she'd be announcing the weapon mistress's inevitable fate. She didn't really pay much attention to the list since she could care less where the rest of her peers would be landing. All she cared about was her name, and her name alone. Apparently, she had been in her own world far longer than she thought since the teacher was announcing the last team already. Thankfully, she didn't need to ask about her team since she already knew who she was placed with. She was kinda disappointed she didn't get to hear who Naruto got placed with, though. Team 6, Tenten Higurashi, Niji Hyuga and Naruto Uzumaki. Your Jonin-sensei will be Kajuro Shimura. It took the bun-haired girl a while to process what had just been said, but once she did, she let out a shout of joy and began rubbing her cheek against her blonde indifferent friend. I don't know or what you did, but we're in the same team. Come here, you big smooch, lovable smooch, blonde smooch, bastard smooch. The last of her words were emphasized by a kiss to the cheek of the unfazed blonde. After some harsh words from her sensei, Tenten sat back in her seat with a grin so wide it threatened to split her face. Shitori-sensei continued by giving her final departing words while introducing the sensei of the new genin. 1 hour later, after waiting an hour, it did not take long for Tenten's high to settle back down to annoyance once again. The first 20 minutes was excusable, the next was inexcusable, the last was completely unprofessional, mixed with the frustration of waiting for an hour and being in the room with two of the most antisociable people in her year. The bun-haired kunoichi decided to speak her mind. What the hell is taking her so long? She asked no one in particular, and rightfully didn't get an answer. She looked to the only other occupants in the room who to gauge their reactions. Niji was still sitting coolly in his holier-than-thou pose, which consisted of him leaning on the edge of the desk with his arms crossed and a leg over the other. She couldn't see his face from where she stood, but she was sure his eyes were closed, increasing Tenten's image of him tenfold. Naruto had, at some point, pulled out a book to start reading. From the blank scroll rolled out across his desk and the ink brush placed neatly on a paper towel, she could tell it had to be a Fuinjutsu scroll. Since she was still stuck on the beginning of the second book, she opted to not take a peek since she didn't want to be spoiled on her future work. The pout on her face was due to the blonde's lack of reaction and definitely not jealousy. Yeah, definitely not jealousy. How exactly are you guys so calm? I know you have the sociability of rocks. But don't you at least think this is a little unprofessional of our sensei to make us wait this long? Niji and the blonde glanced over to the kunoichi for but a moment before returning to their devices. Surprisingly, it was the Hyuga who spoke up first. I concur. Excuse or no, it would not paint a good picture for the sensei if she does not set a good example for the ones that are to follow her in the future. He ended by glancing at the blonde. Seeing that he was not going to get any input, he went back to whatever occupied his previous thoughts. I do not find our sensei's actions to be unprofessional in the slightest, Tenten-san. Naruto suddenly spoke up after a few seconds of silence. Getting a raised brow from the kunoichi and the attention of the Hyuga, Tenten was going to retort, but was beat to the punch by the blonde. After all, she has been standing in that corner since we first walked into this room. A moment of silence passed through the room. About 5 seconds later, a transparent figure skillfully threw something from their concealed spot in the back of the room and caused the blonde to quickly drop his book to deflect the objects with a kunai of his own. Tenten and Niji were shocked for but a moment until they were both into action. Niji immediately had his Byakugan active and launched to meet the charging figure halfway, while Tenten put her training with the blonde to work and pulled multiple kunai from her pouch while getting as far away as possible from the new threat. Niji quickly stopped and thrusted a Juken strike aimed for his opponent's abdomen to start the conflict. Unsurprisingly, she dodged the jab, but surprised him by jumping right over him. He turned to pursue, but was once caught off guard by the paper tag that fell in front of his face. He didn't even have time to blink before the tag let out a loud bang followed by a flash that completely disorientated and blinded the unprepared Hyuga. Niji could do nothing but furiously wipe at his eyes while his former adversary landed and charged his new teammates. Naruto now had his sword unsealed from one of his scrolls and swung it at the blur charging him. There was the sound of metal meeting metal as what could only be the blur besting his sword with something equally durable. Unfortunately for the blur, part of the sword suddenly broke off and began wrapping around her. The blood pulled the sword to capture the blur, but unsurprisingly, it quickly ducked under the sword and swung its sword horizontally at the blonde's torso, who jumped out of range from the attack. Tenten entered the fight by covering her friend's retreat with multiple kunai at their attacker. Multiple metallic clangs rung through the room as the projectiles were knocked from the air and had the blur advancing once again, though she could barely see it. She didn't need to move from the incoming projectile since Naruto deflected it from the air with his sword and went back on the offensive. Naruto didn't let the attack on his friend go unpunished since his sword was now stretching towards his opponent. The blur showed its skill by easily dodging the whip blade in an acrobatic display they couldn't see before jumping to the ceiling, seeing an opportunity of her own. Tenten opened one of her storage scrolls and in a puff of smoke summoned multiple kunai and shuriken before her. Without hesitation or preparation, she began peppering the distorted air on the ceiling. Though there seemed to be no room for much maneuverability, the blur seemed to have no problem avoiding each and every one of her well-placed projectiles. That did not, however, mean she was able to dodge the multiple Juken strikes from her 6 courtesy of a sneering Hyuga, and the whip sword that firmly wrapped around the figure's now falling form. Not wasting a second, the blonde swung his sword and the whip followed, pulling its victim violently and slamming it against the podium at the front of the class. Wooden debris scattered across the room, but the blonde did not reel in his weapon, opting to wait a bit to confirm his opponent's defeat. "You kids are more than your papers would say." Naruto did not move at the voice that came from directly behind him. Tenten and Niji were now glaring at the distortion that was now behind the Uzumaki. The once invisible body was now fading into color, and the blonde could now clearly see the edges of a kunai being held by what he could only assume was a female hand from the voice that had spoken earlier. The hand seemed to be covered by a black gauntlet that held a curved blade along the top. He glanced back at the desk that was destroyed and was not surprised to find a puddle of mud in place of the figure. "I did not expect much from my future students, but you seem to be more than what I've read and observed this past week," though he could not see it. The figure frowned slightly as she glanced down at the kunai held in reverse towards her stomach. "Much more," she whispered before removing her blade from the shorter boy's neck. Naruto pocketed his kunai after the threat on his person was no longer present while reeling in his whip sword. He turned away from his now lightly relaxed teammates to the now visible figure that was behind him. If there was one thing he could say about the woman he was seeing, it was that she was definitely unique. In a normal man's eye, she would be the embodiment of many men's wet fantasy. But the blonde could not see a hint of embarrassment or shame coming from the beautiful woman before him. No man could deny that she was a beauty. She had long brown hair held in a ponytail, and had her bangs covering the right side of her face. A yellow scarf wrapped comfortably around her neck and tied in the back to her thighs. She was wearing a revealing rouge-pink tunic that hugged most of her D-cup breast and had a long flap that covered the middle, and hopefully back, of her lower body. Over the tunic was a brown stomach guard held together by a red rope tied in a knot. On her arms were brown forearm protectors that had a curved blade along the outside with long pink fingerless gloves underneath that went to her mid-bicep. Thigh protectors protected her outer thighs while shin protectors went up to her knees and had on square-toed sandals and a tanto strapped to her side to complete the look. She dresses much differently from the other kunoichi we've encountered, almost more revealing than that snake woman you ran into a few years back. Giving a mental nod to his inner spirit, the Uzumaki decided to speak on the behalf of his two teammates that haven't yet spoken. Am I correct in assuming you are Kajiro Shimura? The woman bowed respectfully at the three recent graduates. You are correct, Uzumaki. However, we will save introductions for later. For now, clean up this classroom and meet me at Akamichi's barbecue in no less than 30 minutes. If you are late by even a second, I will personally make sure you never see Chunin for as long as I live. Am I understood? The seriousness on the Jonin's face made the three genin nod hesitantly. Getting a nod in turn from the Jonin in turn before she suddenly blurred out of sight, the three looked to each other, then the classroom around them before they silently began picking up the kunai and shuriken scattered around the room. Nothing was said even after they finished. They simply walked out of the classroom and to their next destination. Their shinobi careers were about to begin. A few months ago. Naruto's mindscape. Naruto stared up at the smirking goddess after she completed her explanation. To anyone else, the story about a voice in your head being a goddess that was transferred from another due to their father dwelling in arts humans had no business having their hands and would sound more than idiotic. In fact, it sounded downright delusional if you saw it from a third perspective. However, considering he'd literally stopped time throughout his childhood and the fact Bijou, masses of chakra that were said to be demons, walked this continent, it wasn't too far-fetched that the one sitting on a throne before him was actually a goddess. The fact she didn't know anything of her past before now due to amnesia was kinda sketchy. But the blonde could move past that for now. Are you calling me a liar, child? And he completely forgot she could read his mind. We are one and the same, child. Your thoughts are my thoughts, unless I close them out. The only reason you cannot hear my own is because you currently lack the ability to do so. Whether or not I tell you how to accomplish this feat, however, will stay with me indefinitely. Don't look at me like that. Certain things are just not meant for mortal minds. Naruto crossed his arms and shook his head. I do not mind you keeping secrets from me. Sothis, you have taken care of me for 9 years, though I despise secrets. You have more than earned my trust. If you say there are things that I should not know, then I will believe you without a doubt in my mind. Sothis blinked down at her host before a smile appeared on her young face. This is why I like you, child. Easy to please and actually listens. I've once read that those are excellent qualities in human males. Hopping out of her chair, she slowly descended down the stairs till she was on the same level as her host. She walked past the boy that was only 2 inches shorter than she was and to the door at the end of the void. Come, child, there is much we must discuss. Without questioning, Naruto silently followed the goddess as they walked to the now opening wooden doors. Once past, Naruto was shocked to see a library where there was once nothing but the void. Shelves filled with books towered over them and scrolls laid spread over multiple tables around the room. If Naruto could make an estimate, he'd say there were about over 100,000 books currently in this large room of knowledge. I see you are impressed, Sothis mused, turning and smirking at the blonde taking in the room. Your mindscape is but a world you create for yourself. Since we are one and the same, I have taken the liberty of creating somewhat of an archive of both my and your history, though my thoughts will remain my own. You are more than welcome to come here and read the history of my land or how I came to be. Naruto nodded absent-mindedly before going to the nearest bookshelf to his left that was titled History of Fadlan. Next to that was an even larger bookshelf that titled Life of a Goddess, and further down the hall, he could see multiple names that could only be the names of the people the goddess once knew. The left side seemed to hold all knowledge of the goddess and her life. He turned to his right in hopes of confirming a sudden inquiry. His thoughts were confirmed when he saw his name and the elemental nations written above certain bookshelves all along the right side of the room. Amazing, he couldn't help but whisper in awe. Indeed it is. Sothis joined in next to him. All knowledge we've learned throughout our lives are stored in this place. In other words, if you ever forget something, you can always come here to remember or reminisce. For example, the goddess raised a hand in the air and Naruto bore witness to a book on the left that suddenly glowed, removed itself from the shelf and flew into the hand of the awaiting goddess. Naruto looked over at the book to see the title read First Time I Tried Food, Weird. But he said nothing, with just a thought. Anything from yours or my past will be in your hands. Naruto looked down to his own hand in curiosity before raising it above his head, much like the goddess. There was an instant reaction as something from the goddess's side once again glowed bright before flying off the shelf and into his awaiting hand. He looked down at the book to read exactly what he had thought of, the beginning of the progenitor goddess. Just feeling the book brought sudden images into his head. A pillar of light descending to the lands, a tall, parakeet-haired woman walking the lands while passing down her blessings. Multiple people dressed in white robes kneeling before the parakeet-haired woman on a throne. Multiple people with slightly lighter hair laughing alongside the goddess. All these memories invaded the youth's mind in a flash. It was just snippets, but it felt as if he was actually present when the events occurred. He looked to the progenitor goddess, who was now standing expectantly with a proud smirk on her face and hands on her hips. It was the first time he'd heard the goddess show even a hint of pride before him. At least, pretty cool, isn't it? Naruto nodded slowly before letting go of the book and watching as it floated back to its proper space. This is quite impressive indeed, Sothis. If possible, the goddess looked even more proudful than before, with her chest puffed out further, and what was clearly a self-satisfied smirk on her face. It was as he was looking at the smug goddess that a thought suddenly crossed his mind. I've been meaning to ask, but do you, by any chance, know what became of the Kyuubi? The goddess's posture returned to its regular poise before shaking her head. I do not know what became of the beast that was supposed to inhabit your body, she admitted, sounding disappointed at the lack of knowledge. Whether it now roams the lands I once walked, or it inhabits the place I once slept. Only the gods and people of Fodlan will probably ever know that current mystery. Naruto began rubbing his chin in thought. From everything he'd gathered in the time he was here, there could only be a few possibilities on the beast's whereabouts. The first would be that the beast died in the transition, not an impossibility, but unlikely considering the books he had recently read about Jinchuriki. Only thanks to the old man reluctantly giving him the information he wanted that wouldn't be too suspicious of a Jinchuriki to have said that the beast could never truly be killed. They would die for about 4 to 5 years before using the chakra in the air to reform their bodies. Whether or not the beast could do the same in Fodlan was up in the air. But he secretly hoped that wasn't the case. If so, then his father had pretty much damned billions of lives. The second, and more logical, would be, like himself, Sothis had a host prior to himself and the beast now laid within him or her. He had no real proof or basis on that theory, but hoped for that over the former. I would agree with your second thought over the first, Sothis chimed in, reading her host's thoughts once again. Though the first is interest, the latter makes more sense. The day of my passing should have been the day I returned to the skies above, but instead, I slept for centuries. That could only mean someone, or something, was keeping my soul in the land of Fodlan. What they would do to my soul, I could only speculate. In fact, in a way, your father may have saved me from a worse fate than my current one. Naruto blinked slowly before actual emotion showed in the form of furrowed brows that could pass for a pout. Living within me isn't that much of an ordeal. Sothis looked back at him as if what he said was a joke, though she was not at all amused. Then her face scrunched up and she began flouting off the ground. Do you have any idea what you had put me through over the years? The goddess asked hotly, now floating basically in the face of the Uzumaki. The first day I awoke, I was so weak keeping my eyes open was an ordeal in and of itself. I had no idea where I was or had any power to fuel my body, if not enough torture. When I finally got my bearings, found where I was and tried speaking to a child I'd thought would have proper manners, you completely ignored me. Seeing that the blonde looked slightly guilty, she recomposed herself and landed back on the ground, beginning to pace with closed eyes and chin high. If not discovering I was trapped within a child was bad enough, building my power from nothing was far more than a monumental task. The mana from this world is drastically different from that of my own. It took time for me to adapt and convert the energy your people call chakra into mana that I could safely use without tainting my little supply of power. The green-haired girl sighed as she looked to the blonde with a hint of annoyance back on her face. If not tiring enough, I've been forced constantly for years to waste my accumulated energy on saving a child who couldn't keep himself alive if he'd been strapped down in a room of cotton. Not even mentioning draining me dry constantly for your little experiments. You should be more than thankful that I converted your energy to my own on every use of power, otherwise, our powers would have clashed harshly, and you'd be nothing more than a powerless husk that couldn't even contend against the weakest this plane of existence had to offer. Naruto actually looked down as he remembered the things he'd done and took advantage of in the past. He was by no means a savage about what he wanted or needed, but he did not properly ever think about what abusing his only friend, at the time, power would do to her. I am sorry. I should have thought more about your feelings, Sothis. I will make sure to use your power more sparingly in the future. I swear it. Naruto ended his statement with a bow that made the goddess be taken aback for a second. A moment of guilt actually passed her before she was back to her normal self. Humph, I'll forgive you only because you put that power to good use. If you'd had intentionally abused the power I'd granted you, then not only would I have taken it away, I would have crippled us both, destroying both your life and my own before you could become a threat to humanity. Her words, though harsh, did not make the young Uzumaki resent her. There were times in his life that he truly was at his low and wished to use her power to incite violence along the people and the world that had wronged him. The only thing stopping him at the time was what the goddess before him would have thought of him if he had gone down the path of no return. People with power have already proven to do far more than he ever thought humanly acceptable in this world, and he swore to himself he wouldn't stoop to their level no matter the trials that blocked his paths. If he were in Sothis's shoes, he'd probably do the same thing. There were already enough monsters in this world, and knowing she let another rise might have weighed heavy on the goddess's conceits. At least, that what he thought. Thankfully, I've seen you at your best and your worst, the goddess continued, now stopped in front of the downcast blonde. You stayed true to yourself despite this world trying its damnedest to keep you down, and held close the little you had. Most would have broken, but you strived above all obstacles. For that, I stayed by your side and allowed you to abuse my powers as you saw fit. Surprising to the blonde, the goddess gave an almost motherly smile as she reached out and put both hands on both sides of his face, raising his head to meet her seafoam eyes that shined with something akin to pride. Continue down the path you have paved for yourself, child, and I will swear to stay by your side till the day you pass on. That is the promise I make on my name, and as the progenitor goddess of Fodlan. Naruto, for as long as he could remember, knew that his heart never beat. It was always quiet, unmoving. In fact, despite the fact that he was clearly still alive, he never really thought much of it as a child, but knew it was very unnatural for any human being. The older he grew, over time, he thought less and less of it. It was an unnatural phenomenon that didn't seem to have any effect on his life or body, so there was no reason for him to lose sleep over it. But at that moment, when the goddess before him, his first friend and the one person in the world he swore to never betray, spoke those words to him that sounded more fact than a promise, he could swear he heard his heart beat for the first time in his life. He didn't even realize she'd removed her hands from his face until she was talking once again. All right, let's put such trivial matters behind us for now. It is your birthday after all, and there's much more I must show you before the night is over. Watching the goddess leave the room, Naruto followed behind, not noticing the red on his face as they explored deeper into his goddess's world. Byleth, Part 1. Far different from the rest. Byleth knew she was different. She knew that since the day she had happened, the day no one in her father's mercenary group, nor her father himself, ever spoke of again. She was only 7 years old at the time and didn't remember much from that young an age. However, her dreams were all too willing to remind her of what happened that day. It was just like any other day. Her father had needed some supplies before they could continue on their next mission in Rusalka. She wanted to ask her father what type of mission it was since they were going all the way there when they were in Hevering, but decided against it since she knew he'd reply the same way he always does. It's adult business, kiddo. I'll tell you when you're older. Anyways, she had been told to wait outside the smithy they were currently getting their supplies from. Being the kid she was, her attention span wavered easily, and she quickly grew bored of the doll her father had given to her to keep her occupied while he worked. She wanted to play with someone. But the only one who was usually willing, her guard at the time, Finny, was too busy flirting with the flower girl across the street. Despite being a girl herself, bored and out of options, she decided to take a walk around the small village. She figured if she got lost, then all she had to do is ask the nearest villager to point her in the right direction to her father. After wandering for about 30 minutes, Finny, who looked out of breath and was sweating profusely, had found her and gave her a harsh scolding before dragging her back to the smithy. However, halfway there, Byleth began to feel wrong. She couldn't describe the feeling at the time considering she wasn't privy to a whole lot due to her age, but it felt like something was twisting in her heart. No, the problem was her heart. For as long as she lived, she never heard it beat, not even once. Now, it was suddenly beating really fast. Faster than even she thought it was supposed to beat for a normal human being. It didn't hurt, but it felt very uncomfortable, scared. She had reached out to ask Finny if she knew what was wrong with her body. Finny was a leech, but she was really smart at times and Byleth was sure she would know what was going on. That's when her body jerked, and she began to feel the worst pain she would ever experience in her life. She had fallen to the ground and began writhing while screaming at the top of her lungs from the agony she was feeling in her chest. It felt like someone was reaching into her chest and pulling out her heart without cutting her open first. She remembered the tears running down her face and the absolutely terrified look on Finny's face as she panicked to find a solution to her sudden agony. She could barely see through blurry eyes, but something else was apparently happening since she saw multiple blurs run past her. Finny was looking even more distraught and eventually picked her up and began running with her somewhere that was, hopefully, her father. If anyone knew, then her father would know what to do about the pain she was feeling that was not going away. She was not carried far since not even a minute into their run, she was dropped harshly on the ground and rolled a few meters before coming to a stop on her stomach. The pain had now stretched to her entire body and it felt like she was on fire. She just wanted the pain to stop. She wanted her father, no, anyone to stop the pain she was feeling. She opened her eyes desperately and looked through her tears to find anyone that would be her savior. What she saw instead was something she wished she could forget every day. Finny, her blonde strands painted to her face by the sweat, was staring right back at her with wide eyes that held no light. Despite the pain, Byleth was able to skin down the woman's face and would throw up if she could at the sight. Her entire body from the neck down was gone. But more than her body, it was where her body was that raised the already distraught girl's fear to the max. A beast, for a lack of a better word, was tearing and ripping apart what used to be Finny's body. The monster towered over her easily and had a width of about 4 meters and length of over 8. Its entire skin was blackened and bones outlined its dark skin. Past this one monster was multiple other similar monsters raiding the village and attacking anything that moved. She was sure some of the mercenaries were fighting off the beasts invading this place and could scream for help. But she was too focused on the monster tearing her friend apart, and the pain she was still in to think properly. Then the monster turned its gaze to her, and she knew real fear. Its red eyes were locked on her figure, and she couldn't do anything but look at it fearfully. It suddenly began sniffing the air as if looking for something on her. As if finding a better meal, it casually tossed away the mangled corpse in its opposable hands and slowly walked towards her. She would never forget that moment in her life. She felt fear, pain, anguish, but as the monster grew closer and closer, the pain began to become more and more bearable and a new emotion began bubbling in her gut. Rage, pure, unadulterated rage. Rage for that monster taking away one of her friends. Rage for the people these things killing these poor townsfolk. And rage for all the pain she was in. She just felt so angry. She didn't see her skin reddening. She didn't see the bubbling aura coming from her body. She didn't see the scarred whisker marks that were now on her face become more feral. All she saw was red. Then she was on all fours and charging right at the beast that had killed one of her friends. It didn't even get a chance to put up a fight since it was tackled to its back with the force of a wind spell. She then began to use her now elongated nails to tear open the beast while it writhed in agony. She did not stop clawing at its stomach, throat, and anything else she could get her hands on until it was no longer moving. Once this one stopped moving, she moved like an enchanted arrow towards the next big beast and did the exact same, disregarding the little humans that got injured by standing in her way. These beasts needed to pay for killing her friend, and she wouldn't stop until every last one of them were dead. When all the beasts had been slain, she stood huffing in the middle of a bloodied village. Multiple corpses, both human and monster, laid at her feet, while she was covered head to toe with the blood of both. Those who got in her way were slain, and those who looked like a monster was slain. No one was given mercy because none deserved any. Even the human that was slowly walking towards her, his orange armor, blonde hair and familiar. "D-Dad?" It was the first time she'd heard her voice outside the screaming she'd been doing for the past 30 minutes. It was deep and sound scarier than she'd ever remembered it being. This wasn't her. This couldn't be her. She finally got a good look at her surroundings and her eyes widened almost to inhuman proportions. The red bubbly aura had began flowing to her stomach, disappearing completely after a few seconds. But she wasn't paying attention to it. All she could see was the destruction that was once a peaceful village, the bodies that laid everywhere, some killed by the monsters, while the others. Before she knew it, she was engulfed by strong arms despite the red she was covered in. She glanced to her left, and was met with a mop of blonde hair. Seconds later, she could hear soothing words being whispered into her ear, and tears began flowing down her cheeks for the second time in an hour. That day, she showed more emotion than she'd done her entire life, and showed much more years after. Her father would later insist that nothing was her fault, but she never forgave herself for what she'd done. Whatever took hold of her that day, no survivor ever spoke of again. It was a moment in her life that she'd never forget, and never be able to move on from for as long as she lived. That's why she threw herself into training. She mastered the sword and every other weapon her father could teach her at the age of 8. By the time she was 12, she'd learned everything her father could teach her and finally took charge in battles when she was 15, killing every black beast and bandit she came by. It would never remove the blood on her hands, but it was how she redeemed herself. It also kept her mind away from the changes her body had went through. The first, an obvious change, was the whisker marks scared onto her face. No matter how many years went by, it was the one wound that never healed over the years, along with a weird spiral symbol that looked like ink on her stomach. After trying to remove it several times via mage or by other means, she and her father had agreed to not tamper with it any longer. The next was her teeth, nails and eyes. Whenever something deeply angered her, her eyes would become slit like that of a fox, her nails would elongate, and her normal canines would become much longer and sharper than they had the right to be. Thanks to some meditation training, she'd been able to calm herself on and off the battlefield, and there was little now that could anger her. The final change had everything to do with her mana and body. Her mana was now far larger than even the best mages of Fodlan. However, she couldn't use a drop of it for a reason she still wasn't privy to this day. Whenever she tried to cast a spell, the gathered mana from the books just never agreed with her own, and it always ended up causing her great pain before forcing her to drop the tome or technique. Thankfully, the fact that she regenerated far faster than any normal human being should be capable of even out the fact she couldn't use her huge mana supply, sorta. She knew where all this sudden power came from, but never wanted to acknowledge its existence. Correction, she wouldn't acknowledge it, even if the power boost it gave far exceeded anything she'd ever seen. It was power that was far too tainted and uncontrollable for her liking, and she swore to never use it no matter the cost. Whatever was in her should never be out, and she wouldn't give it the satisfaction of taking control of her once again, and taking away the little she loved. She swore it. However, you can only run so far from the inevitable, and her current situation proved that. The white-haired teenager she had been fighting alongside had foolishly dropped her guard and weapon on the pretense of victory against her opponent. Next thing the girl knew, her opponent was back on her feet with the girl's axe in his hand and bringing it down to end her life. Being the only one close enough to do something, Byleth shielded the girl with the only thing able to spot the force of the boorish man, her body. She had blacked out after the axe had removed a significant portion of her stomach. Though her body healed faster than any human being, she was sure this particular blow would be the end of her. Saving the white-haired girl was the only thing on her mind at that moment, and her body moved before she could even think properly. She had no regrets, however. If she didn't put her body in harm's way, then that girl would not have survived that attack. She was still but a teenager and had far much more to live for than a monster like herself. At least, she could die knowing she tried her best to live for the many she had murdered. But she didn't die. There was no pain, no light, nothing. In fact, she felt as if being nearly chopped in half was but a dream. That thought was only heightened by the dungeon she found herself in. Corridors and corridors or jail cells filled with nothing but the bones of humans and demonic beasts. It was unsettling, but she couldn't help but find her surroundings a little ironic. All her life, people have told her that her way of thinking was no different than being a prisoner to herself, as if she had been paying for the lives she had taken by living every minute to redeem herself by saving more lives than she took. It was only now that she walked through this place that she finally understood what they meant. Finally, after walking for what felt like hours, she came to a stop at a stairway that led down deeper into the dungeon. Torches lit the path all the way to a door below that seemed far too ominous for her liking. Nonetheless, something was pushing for her to move forward, as if answers to questions she never asked would be behind that door. So, she continued down, her boots echoing through the tunnel till she came to a stop in front of the door. The ominous feeling she got before was much stronger now as well as familiar. With a single push, she opened the door wide and was met with a much larger dungeon that held one titanic cage in the back. Giant torches lit the room a soft golden and made the prison bars less scary than it actually was. Despite the slight fear she was feeling from this room and despite not being able to see just what those bars held behind it, Byleth stepped forward. She knew something was there, and she knew it had to be the one who had summoned her to this place.